April 12, 2025, Kodiak Bear destroys $1.2 million police armory in Homer, Alaska. The morning mist clung to Kachemak Bay like a shroud as Sergeant Paul Keating pulled his patrol cruiser into the Homer Police Department parking lot at 5:47 a.m. The 34-year-old veteran officer had seen his share of unusual calls during his 12 years on the force, but nothing could have prepared him for what would unfold in the next few hours. Paul ran his calloused hand through his graying brown hair and took a long sip of black coffee from his thermos, watching the sun struggle to break through the thick Alaskan clouds that had settled over the small coastal town overnight. Homer, Alaska, population 5,800, sat perched on the edge of the world like a forgotten outpost. Known for its thriving halibut fishing industry and the famous Homer Spit that jutted 4.5 miles into the bay, the town had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the wilderness that surrounded it on three sides. To the east, the Kenai Mountains rose like sleeping giants, their snow-capped peaks disappearing into the perpetual cloud cover. To the south, the vast expanse of Kachemak Bay stretched toward the volcanic peaks of the Aleutian Range, and to the north, an endless expanse of spruce forest, alder thickets, and marshy tundra extended all the way to Anchorage, 226 miles away. Paul had grown up in this landscape. Born in Soldotna to a family of commercial fishermen, he understood the rhythms of this harsh country better than most. His father, Michael Keating, had taught him to read weather patterns, animal signs, and the subtle changes in the forest that could mean the difference between life and death. "The wilderness doesn't care about your plans, son," his father used to say, while they tracked moose through the autumn woods. "It's got its own agenda, and you better respect that if you want to see another sunrise." Those words echoed in Paul's mind as he stepped out of his cruiser and noticed something odd about the morning air. There was a smell, thick and musky, that didn't belong in the sterile environment of the police station parking lot. He paused, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon, a Glock 22.40 caliber that he'd drawn only 3 times in his entire career. The scent was wild, primal, something that triggered ancient warning systems buried deep in his DNA. Officer Linda Wright arrived 10 minutes later in her own patrol vehicle, a newer Ford Police Interceptor that still carried the new car smell despite 6 months of service. At 28, Linda was the department's youngest officer and one of only 2 women on the 12-person force. She had moved to Homer from Fairbanks 3 years earlier, drawn by the promise of small-town policing and the opportunity to work in one of Alaska's most picturesque communities. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes held the alertness of someone who had learned not to take anything for granted in a place where civilization was always just one bad decision away from complete collapse. "Morning, Sarge," Linda called out as she locked her vehicle. "Sleep well?" Paul nodded, but didn't respond immediately. He was still trying to identify that smell, and something about Linda's cheerful demeanor seemed incongruous with the tension he felt building in his chest. "You notice anything strange about this morning?" he asked. Linda paused and looked around the parking lot, her training kicking in. The Homer Police Department building was a modest, single-story structure built in 1987. Constructed of concrete blocks and designed to withstand the harsh coastal weather. The armory was housed in a reinforced section on the north side of the building, containing the department's arsenal of patrol rifles, shotguns, tactical gear, and ammunition. The building had always felt secure to Linda, a fortress of order in a chaotic world. "Can't say that I do," she replied, but her hand unconsciously moved to her radio. "Why? What's got you spooked?" Before Paul could answer, the radio crackled to life. Dispatcher Margaret Chen's voice cut through the morning stillness with the kind of calm urgency that veteran officers learn to recognize as the precursor to chaos. "All units, We've got a report of a large animal sighting near the intersection of East End Road and Kachemak Drive. Caller describes it as a brown bear, possibly a Kodiak, approximately 12 to 1,300 pounds. Animal appears agitated and is moving toward the city centre. Paul and Linda exchanged glances. Brown bear sightings weren't unusual in Homer, especially during salmon runs or when the berry crops were poor, but a Kodiak bear of that size was a different matter entirely. Kodiak bears, found primarily on Kodiak Island and the Alaskan Peninsula, were the largest subspecies of brown bear in North America. An adult male could weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand 10 feet tall on its hind legs. They were apex predators, with no natural enemies except humans, and even then, the advantage was questionable. "Margaret, this is Keating," Paul spoke into his shoulder mic. "Can you get Fish and Game on the line? We're going to need tranquilizer equipment and probably a transport cage." "Already tried, Paul," Margaret's voice crackled back. "Agent Morrison is in Kenai on another call. Won't be back until this afternoon. Agent Sullivan is in Anchorage for a court hearing. Looks like we're on our own for now." Linda felt her stomach tighten. She had undergone bear awareness training at the academy, but facing a Kodiak bear with nothing but standard police equipment was like trying to stop a freight train with a fly swatter. "What's the protocol here, Sarge?" Paul was already moving toward the building, his keys jingling as he searched for the right one. "We get into the armory, grab the heavy rifles, and hope this thing wanders back into the forest before someone gets hurt." He paused at the door and looked back at Linda. "And we call Chief Brennan. He's going to want to coordinate with the mayor's office on this one." Chief Robert Brennan had been running the Homer Police Department for 15 years, ever since retiring as a captain from the Anchorage Police Department. At 58, he was a bear of a man himself, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 250 pounds, of mostly muscle despite his age. His salt and pepper beard and weathered face gave him the appearance of a grizzled sea captain, which wasn't far from the truth. He had spent his youth working fishing boats in the Gulf of Alaska before deciding that law enforcement offered better job security. Brennan's phone rang at exactly 6:15 a.m. while he was shaving in the bathroom of his modest house on Sterling Highway, just outside the Homer city limits. The call came from his wife of 32 years, Patricia, who was already at her job as a nurse at South Peninsula Hospital. "Bob, you need to turn on the news." Patricia's voice was tight with concern. "They're showing aerial footage of a massive bear walking down Pioneer Avenue. It's heading straight toward downtown." Brennan set down his razor and walked to the bedroom, where the television was already tuned to KTUU Channel 2 News. The helicopter camera showed what appeared to be the largest brown bear he had ever seen casually strolling down the main thoroughfare of Homer, Alaska. Cars were pulling off the road, and early morning joggers were sprinting in the opposite direction. The animal moved with the confident, unhurried gait of an apex predator that had never encountered anything capable of challenging its dominance. "Jesus Christ," Brennan muttered, reaching for his uniform shirt. "That thing's got to weigh 1,400 pounds. Erdartil," the helicopter pilot's voice provided running commentary. "The animal appears to be a mature male Kodiak bear, and folks, I've covered a lot of wildlife stories in my 20 years of flying, but I have never seen anything this size moving through a populated area. The bear seems focused on something, and it's heading directly toward the government district of Homer." Brennan's blood ran cold. The government district was a cluster of municipal buildings that included City Hall, the fire department, and the police station. More importantly, it housed the Homer Police Department's armory, which contained enough firepower to supply a small army. If that bear somehow got into the building. His phone rang again. This time, it was Paul Keating. "Chief, we've got a situation." Paul's voice was steady, but carried an undertone of barely controlled anxiety. "That bear everyone's talking about, it just turned into our parking lot." Through the windows of the police station, Paul and Linda could see the massive creature as it approached the building. Even from a distance of 50 yards, the animal's size was overwhelming. Its shoulder muscles rippled beneath a coat of dark brown fur that seemed to absorb the morning light. The bear's head was easily as large as a bushel basket, and its small, dark eyes held an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. "It's beautiful," Linda whispered, then immediately felt foolish for the comment. Paul understood exactly what she meant. There was something majestic about the animal, something that spoke to a time when creatures like this ruled the North American continent without interference from humans. But beauty and danger often went hand in hand in Alaska, and Paul had seen enough of both to know that this situation was about to go very bad, very quickly. The bear paused in the parking lot, raised its massive head, and tested the air. Its black nose twitched as it processed the dozens of scents that humans had left behind: exhaust fumes, coffee, gun oil, cleaning solvents, and something else. Something that made the animal's eyes narrow with interest. Inside the police station, Margaret Chen was fielding calls from across the city. The 911 system was lighting up with reports of the bear's progress through town, and every call painted a picture of an animal that was not exhibiting normal bear behavior. Instead of foraging for food or showing signs of confusion at finding itself in an urban environment, the bear seemed to have a specific destination in mind. "Margaret," Paul called from the hallway, "I need you to initiate Code Red protocols. Lock down all exterior doors, activate the emergency alert system, and get on the horn with the state troopers. We need helicopter support and wildlife management personnel here as soon as possible." Margaret nodded and began working her way through the emergency checklist. She had been the department's primary dispatcher for 8 years, and she prided herself on maintaining calm under pressure. But as she watched the security monitors, she felt a chill run down her spine. The bear was now less than 20 yards from the building, and it was moving with purpose. Officer Jennifer Valdez had just arrived for her shift when she saw the commotion in the parking lot. At 31, Jennifer was a 5-year veteran of the department and one of the most level-headed officers on the force. She had grown up in rural Montana and had encountered her share of dangerous wildlife, including black bears and mountain lions. But this animal was something else entirely. "Holy shit!" she breathed, forgetting protocol as she watched the massive bear approach the building. "That thing's the size of a small car." Paul emerged from the armory carrying a Remington 870 shotgun loaded with slugs and a Ruger Mini 14 rifle chambered in .308 Winchester. The rifle was the most powerful weapon in the department's arsenal, capable of bringing down large game at extended range. But looking at the size of the bear outside, Paul wondered if even the .308 would be sufficient to stop such a massive animal. "Linda, Jennifer," he called, "I want you both to get on the radio and coordinate evacuation of the surrounding buildings. This thing gets inside, we're going to have casualties." The bear was now investigating the police vehicles parked outside. It approached Paul's patrol cruiser and placed a massive paw on the hood, leaving deep scratches in the paint. The vehicle's suspension compressed under the animal's weight, and the entire car rocked as the bear examined this strange metal object that smelled of humans. Inside the building, the officers could hear the sound of metal groaning under pressure. The bear had moved to Linda's patrol car and was pressing its full weight against the driver's side door. The window exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the parking lot, and the bear's massive head disappeared into the vehicle's interior. "What the hell is it doing?" Jennifer whispered. Paul raised his rifle and tried to get a clear shot through the windows, but the angle was wrong, and he couldn't risk hitting one of the patrol car's fuel tanks. The last thing they needed was an explosion that might injure innocent bystanders or further enrage the animal. The bear emerged from Linda's patrol car, holding something in its jaws. an evidence collection kit that contained various chemicals and processing materials. The animal shook the plastic case like a dog with a chew toy, scattering forensic supplies across the parking lot. Then, with movements too quick for an animal of its size, the bear turned its attention to the police station building itself. The first impact came without warning. The bear charged the main entrance with the force of a wrecking ball, its 1,300-pound frame, striking the reinforced glass doors with tremendous force. The security glass held, but spiderweb cracks appeared across its surface, and the entire door frame shook. "Jesus Christ," Paul muttered, raising his rifle. "It's trying to get in." The second impact shattered the doors completely. Glass and metal fragments exploded inward as the bear forced its way into the building's main lobby. The animal had to duck to fit through the doorway, and even then, its massive shoulders scraped against the frame, leaving gouges in the painted steel. Margaret Chen's training took over. She immediately activated the building's emergency lockdown system, sealing the interior doors and triggering alarms throughout the facility. But the bear was already inside, and the lobby's open design gave it access to most of the building's main floor. The animal paused in the lobby, once again testing the air with its sensitive nose. The scents here were overwhelming: gun oil, cleaning chemicals, coffee, human sweat, and something else that made the bear's eyes narrow with interest. The scent was coming from the north side of the building, where the armory was located. Paul keyed his radio with shaking hands. "All units, code red, code red. We have a large brown bear inside the police station. Repeat, the animal is inside the building. We need immediate backup and wildlife management personnel." Chief Brennan's voice crackled back immediately. "Paul, I'm 5 minutes out. Do not engage that animal unless you have no choice. Those things can absorb a tremendous amount of damage and keep coming." But even as Brennan spoke, the situation was escalating beyond anyone's control. The bear had located the source of the scent that had attracted it to the building in the first place. With movements that seemed impossible for an animal of its size, the bear began forcing its way through the interior hallway toward the armory. The hallway was too narrow for the bear's massive frame, but the animal didn't seem to care. It lowered its head and began pushing forward, its shoulders scraping paint off the walls and its claws leaving deep gouges in the linoleum flooring. The fluorescent lights above flickered and went out as the bear's bulk pressed against the ceiling tiles. Linda had taken position at the end of the hallway with her service weapon drawn, but she quickly realized the futility of trying to stop such a massive animal with a pistol. The bear's skull alone probably weighed more than she did, and its thick fur and muscle would absorb the impact of small-caliber rounds like a sponge. "Sarge, I don't think this is going to work," she called to Paul, who was trying to maneuver the rifle in the confined space. Paul nodded grimly. "Fall back to the communications room. We'll make our stand there." But the bear had other plans. With a tremendous roar that shook the entire building, the animal suddenly accelerated, smashing through the hallway like a furry battering ram. The walls on either side cracked under the pressure, and chunks of drywall fell from the ceiling. The bear emerged into the main office area like a force of nature unleashed. Desks and chairs were scattered as the animal moved through the space, driven by instincts that were as old as the continent itself. The scent that had attracted it was stronger now, coming from just beyond the reinforced door marked "Armory Authorized Personnel Only." Officer James Martinez had been in the break room when the bear entered the building. At 29, Martinez was relatively new to the Houma Police Department, having transferred from the Los Angeles Police Department seeking a quieter life in small-town Alaska. He had never imagined that quiet life would include being trapped in a building with an enraged Kodiak bear. Martinez grabbed his radio and tried to coordinate with the other officers, but the bear's roaring and the sound of destruction made communication nearly impossible. He could hear Paul shouting orders and Linda calling for backup, but the words were lost in the chaos. The bear had reached the armory door and was investigating the heavy steel barrier with its sensitive nose. The door was designed to withstand break-in attempts by humans, not by a 1,300-pound apex predator with claws that could shred steel like paper. The animal began testing the door's hinges, applying pressure with its massive paws and probing for weaknesses in the structure. Paul realized what was happening and felt his blood turn to ice. The armory contained not just weapons and ammunition, but also tactical equipment, riot gear, and various chemical agents used for crowd control. If the bear got inside and began destroying that equipment, the results could be catastrophic. "Linda Jennifer Martinez, everybody out of the building now," Paul shouted into his radio. "This thing's going after the armory." But even as the officers began evacuating, the bear found what it was looking for. The armory door's locking mechanism was electronic, controlled by a keypad and magnetic locks. The bear's investigation had damaged the electrical conduits running to the door, and with a series of clicks, the magnetic locks disengaged. The door swung open, and the bear pushed its way into the armory like a conqueror claiming its prize. The armory was a rectangular room measuring 20 feet by 30 feet, with reinforced walls and a ceiling designed to contain explosions. Steel shelving units lined the walls, holding an arsenal that represented years of federal grants and careful budgeting. There were patrol rifles, tactical shotguns, sniper rifles, body armor, ammunition in various calibers, flashbang grenades, tear gas canisters, and riot control equipment. The bear entered this space like a wrecking ball unleashed in a china shop. Its massive frame knocked over the first shelving unit, sending weapons and ammunition cascading to the floor. The sound was deafening, a metallic avalanche that could be heard throughout the building. Outside, Chief Brennan had arrived and was trying to coordinate the response. Fire trucks and ambulances were racing toward the scene, their sirens creating a symphony of emergency that could be heard throughout Homer. The local television stations had arrived as well, their helicopter cameras capturing footage that would soon be broadcast around the world. "What's the status?" Brennan demanded as he approached Paul, who had taken position behind his patrol car. "It's in the armory, Chief," Paul replied, his voice tight with tension. "That thing's tearing apart everything we've got in there." Through the broken doors of the police station, they could hear the sounds of continued destruction. The bear seemed to be systematically destroying everything it encountered, driven by instincts that none of them could understand. Steel shelving units crashed to the floor, followed by the distinctive sounds of metal being bent and twisted. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie arrived on the scene at 7:30 a.m. As the region's leading wildlife biologist, she had been called in to provide expert consultation on the situation. At 45, Mackenzie had spent her entire career studying the behavior of large predators, with a particular focus on brown bears and their interactions with human populations. "I've never seen anything like this," she told Chief Brennan as they watched the building shake from the continued destruction inside. "This bear is exhibiting behavior that's completely outside normal parameters. It's almost as if it's searching for something specific." "What could a bear possibly want in a police armory?" Brennan asked. Dr. Mackenzie shook her head. "That's what worries me. Bears are attracted to scents, particularly food odors, petroleum products, and certain chemicals, but they don't typically exhibit this kind of focused, purposeful behavior in urban environments." As if to punctuate her words, another tremendous crash echoed from inside the building. This was followed by a new sound, the distinctive hiss of pressurized gas being released. "Tear gas," Paul said grimly. "It's gotten into the riot control equipment." Within moments, a cloud of CS gas began drifting out of the building's broken windows. The bear's roaring became even more pronounced, but instead of fleeing from the irritating chemical, the animal seemed to become more agitated. Dr. Mackenzie felt her scientific curiosity overcome her natural caution. "I need to get closer," she told Brennan. This bear's behavior is unprecedented. There might be something medically wrong with it. Rabies, brain injury, exposure to toxins. If we can understand what's driving this behavior, we might be able to predict what it will do next. Inside the armory, the bear was methodically destroying everything it encountered. Ammunition boxes were crushed and scattered, their contents spilling across the floor in a deadly rainbow of brass and lead. Rifle stocks were snapped like twigs, and tactical gear was shredded by claws that could have carved their owner's name in granite. The bear paused at a locked gun cabinet containing the department's sniper rifles and specialized weapons. The cabinet was constructed of heavy-gauge steel and secured with multiple locks, but the bear approached it with the same systematic determination it had shown throughout its rampage. Officer Linda Wright had taken position at the communications center, where she was coordinating with emergency response teams throughout the region. The Alaska State Troopers had dispatched a helicopter crew equipped with tranquilizer equipment, but they were still at least 30 minutes away. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game was sending every available wildlife management officer, but most were scattered across the state on other assignments. "We're on our own until help arrives," Linda reported to Chief Brennan over the radio. "The closest tranquilizer equipment is in Soldotna, and they're having trouble with their helicopter." Margaret Chen had remained at her dispatcher's position despite the evacuation order, coordinating the emergency response and keeping track of personnel. As the senior dispatcher, she felt responsible for maintaining communications until the situation was resolved. "We've got media requests coming in from all over the country," she told Brennan over the radio. "CNN, Fox News, Animal Planet. They all want live footage of what's happening here." The bear's destruction of the gun cabinet produced a sound like thunder. The heavy steel door was ripped from its hinges and thrown across the room, where it embedded itself in the opposite wall. The cabinet's contents, precision rifles worth tens of thousands of dollars, were scattered like pickup sticks. Dr. Mackenzie was now close enough to observe the bear through the broken windows, and what she saw defied everything she knew about brown bear behavior. The animal was not acting randomly or driven by simple aggression. Instead, it seemed to be conducting a systematic search of the armory, examining each item it encountered before either discarding it or destroying it completely. "This is unprecedented," she whispered into her radio. "The bear is exhibiting problem-solving behavior that suggests higher cognitive function than we typically associate with this species. It's not just destroying things, it's searching for something." As if responding to her observation, the bear suddenly stopped its destruction and raised its massive head. For a moment, the building was silent except for the sound of settling debris. Then, with movements that seemed almost purposeful, the bear began examining a particular section of the armory floor. The bear had found what it was looking for. Beneath a pile of destroyed equipment lay a small metal box that had been damaged in the carnage. The box contained evidence from a recent drug bust, including several pounds of methamphetamine that had been seized during a raid on a local laboratory. The chemicals used in methamphetamine production create a distinctive scent that can attract certain animals, particularly those with compromised nervous systems. Dr. Mackenzie realized what was happening just as the bear began pawing at the damaged evidence box. "Chief Brennan, we need to evacuate a much wider area immediately. If that bear has been exposed to methamphetamine or the chemicals used to produce it, its behavior could become completely unpredictable." Brennan felt his heart sink. Methamphetamine-exposed animals had been documented in other parts of Alaska, usually bears that had discovered illegal drug labs in remote areas. The chemical exposure could cause permanent brain damage, leading to erratic behavior, loss of natural fear of humans, and extreme aggression. "How wide do we need to go?" he asked. "At least 6 blocks in every direction," Dr. Mackenzie replied. "And we need to assume that this animal will not respond to normal deterrents. It may not stop until it's completely destroyed its target or until... She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. The bear might not stop until it was dead. The evacuation of downtown Homer began at 8:15 a.m. Police officers, firefighters, and emergency management personnel went door to door, informing residents and business owners that they needed to leave the area immediately. The process was complicated by the fact that many people wanted to stay and watch the unprecedented event unfolding at the police station. Mayor Catherine Walsh arrived on scene at 8:30 a.m. and immediately began coordinating with state and federal authorities. At 52, Walsh had been Homer's mayor for 6 years and had dealt with her share of crises, including earthquakes, tsunamis, and severe winter storms. But a drug-crazed Kodiak bear destroying the police station was definitely a first. "What are our options?" she asked Chief Brennan during a hastily organized command meeting. "We wait for the tranquilizer equipment to arrive and hope we can sedate the animal before it decides to leave the building," Brennan replied. "If it gets out and starts moving through the downtown area with people around." The implications were clear. A 1,300-pound bear with compromised brain function loose in a populated area would be a massacre waiting to happen. Inside the armory, the bear had consumed some of the spilled methamphetamine and was now exhibiting even more erratic behavior. Its movements became more rapid and less coordinated, and its vocalizations changed from the deep roars of an angry bear to higher-pitched sounds that suggested extreme agitation. The animal began destroying equipment with increased violence, as if the drugs in its system had amplified its natural strength. Steel shelving units that had withstood the bear's initial assault were now being torn apart like cardboard. The sound of destruction reached a crescendo that could be heard for blocks in every direction. Sergeant Paul Keating made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Instead of waiting for backup, he decided to try to end the situation before it could escalate further. Armed with the Ruger Mini 14 rifle and accompanied by Officer Linda Wright, he approached the police station's main entrance. "Paul, don't do this," Chief Brennan's voice crackled over the radio. "Wait for the tranquilizer crew." "Chief, that thing's going to bring down the whole building," Paul replied. "And if it gets out of there while it's drugged up, we're going to have bodies scattered all over downtown Homer." Paul and Linda entered the building through the shattered main doors, moving carefully through the debris-strewn lobby. The smell of tear gas still hung in the air, making their eyes water and their throats burn. From the direction of the armory, they could hear the ongoing sounds of destruction punctuated by the bear's increasingly agitated vocalizations. They reached the entrance to the armory hallway and peered around the corner. What they saw defied description. The bear had completely destroyed the interior of the armory, reducing thousands of dollars worth of equipment to twisted metal and scattered debris. Ammunition was scattered across the floor like deadly confetti, and the walls were scarred with deep claw marks. The bear itself was a sight from a nightmare. Its normally thick, lustrous fur was matted with sweat and chemical residue. Its eyes were wide and unfocused, reflecting the influence of the drugs it had consumed. Foam flecked its massive jaws, and its breathing was rapid and labored. "Jesus Christ," Linda whispered. "What do we do now?" Paul raised the rifle and tried to get a clear shot at the animal's head, knowing that only a perfect shot would bring down something that size. But the bear was moving constantly, and the confined space made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The bear suddenly detected their presence and turned toward the hallway with movements too quick for such a large animal. Its drug-enhanced senses locked onto the two officers, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, predator and humans stared at each other across 20 feet of destroyed office space. Then the bear charged. Paul fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the 308 rounds, striking the bear in the chest and shoulder. Under normal circumstances, those shots would have been enough to bring down any North American predator. But methamphetamine had turned the bear's nervous system into a chemical storm. that blocked pain signals and amplified aggression. The bear barely slowed. Linda drew her service weapon and added her fire to Paul's, emptying her magazine into the charging animal. The 9mm rounds struck the bear, but were absorbed by its massive muscle mass like raindrops hitting a mountainside. Paul managed to fire 2 more rounds before the bear reached him. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. The bear's massive paw caught Paul across the chest, sending him flying backward into the wall, with enough force to crack his ribs and drive the air from his lungs. Linda tried to reload, but the bear was already turning toward her. She had time for one coherent thought: this is how I'm going to die, before 1,300 pounds of chemically enhanced predator slammed into her with the force of an avalanche. The bear's jaws closed on Linda's left arm, and she felt bones snap like dry twigs. The pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined, a white-hot explosion that seemed to encompass her entire being. The bear shook her like a rag doll, its massive head whipping back and forth with enough force to tear muscle and sinew. Paul struggled to his feet, his vision blurred by pain and the effects of his collision with the wall. He could see Linda being mauled by the bear, could hear her screams echoing through the destroyed building. He raised his rifle again, but the bear and Linda were too close together for him to risk a shot. Outside, the sound of gunfire and human screams galvanized the emergency response. Chief Brennan grabbed a shotgun from his vehicle and ran toward the building, followed by Officers Martinez and Valdez. Dr. Mackenzie was shouting warnings about the bear's drug-enhanced capabilities, but her words were lost in the chaos. Inside the building, Linda's screams had stopped. The bear released her mangled arm and stepped back, its drug-addled brain trying to process what had just happened. Linda lay motionless on the debris-strewn floor, blood pooling beneath her body. Paul managed to work the rifle's bolt and chamber another round. This time he had a clear shot at the bear's head, and he took it without hesitation. The .308 round struck the animal just behind the left ear, penetrating the skull and causing massive trauma to the brain. The bear staggered but didn't fall. The methamphetamine in its system was still driving its nervous system, overriding the signals that should have shut down its motor functions. It turned toward Paul again, blood streaming from the head wound, and prepared for another charge. Paul's second shot struck the bear in the center of the forehead, and this time the massive animal finally dropped. It fell forward like a collapsing building, its 1,300-pound frame hitting the floor with an impact that shook the entire police station. Chief Brennan and the other officers burst into the building to find Paul kneeling beside Linda's unconscious form, trying to stop the bleeding from her mangled arm. The bear lay motionless nearby, its massive bulk taking up most of the destroyed armory space. "Get the paramedics in here now!" Brennan shouted into his radio. "We've got an officer down!" The paramedics who responded to the scene were veterans of Alaska emergency medicine, accustomed to dealing with trauma cases involving wildlife encounters. But even they were shocked by the extent of Linda's injuries. Her left arm had been virtually shredded by the bear's teeth and claws, and she had lost a significant amount of blood. EMT supervisor Michael Rodriguez worked quickly to stabilize Linda for transport to South Peninsula Hospital. At 34, Rodriguez had seen his share of bear attack victims, but this case was complicated by the confined space and the presence of tear gas residue in the air. "We need to get her to Anchorage," Rodriguez told Chief Brennan as they loaded Linda into the ambulance. "The trauma center there has the surgical capabilities she's going to need." Paul Keating rode in the ambulance with Linda, his own injuries forgotten in his concern for his fellow officer. His ribs were cracked, and his vision was still blurry from his impact with the wall, but he refused medical attention until Linda was stabilized. The helicopter flight to Anchorage took 45 minutes, with Linda slipping in and out of consciousness during the journey. The trauma team at Alaska Native Medical Center was waiting when they arrived, and Linda was rushed into surgery within minutes of touchdown. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the chief of trauma surgery, spent 6 hours reconstructing Linda's left arm. The bear's teeth had severed major blood vessels, tendons and nerves, and several bones were completely fractured. The surgery was successful, but Dr. Morrison warned that Linda would require months of rehabilitation and might never regain full use of her arm. Paul Keating spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for his injuries, which included 4 cracked ribs, a concussion, and severe bruising across his chest and back. But his physical wounds were minor compared to the psychological trauma of the encounter. "I keep seeing that thing charging at us," he told the police department's psychologist during his first counseling session. "In my dreams, it never stops. It just keeps coming, no matter how many times I shoot it." The investigation into the incident was led by Alaska State Trooper Captain James Burke, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had seen his share of unusual cases. But a methamphetamine-crazed Kodiak bear destroying a police armory was definitely unique. "We found evidence of at least 3 different illegal drug operations in the bear's system," Captain Burke reported to the press 3 days after the incident. "Methamphetamine, cocaine, and several unidentified synthetic compounds. This animal had been consuming drugs for an extended period, which explains its abnormal behavior and extreme aggression." The bear's carcass was examined by a team of veterinary pathologists from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Dr. Robert Chen, the lead pathologist, discovered extensive brain damage consistent with chronic drug exposure. "This bear's brain showed signs of severe chemical damage," Dr. Chen reported. "The drug exposure had basically turned it into a 1,300-pound psychotic. It had lost all normal behavioral patterns and survival instincts." The source of the bear's drug exposure was traced to an illegal methamphetamine laboratory that had been operating in a remote cabin about 30 miles northeast of Homer. The lab had been abandoned several months earlier, leaving behind contaminated equipment and chemical waste that had attracted local wildlife. Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologist Mark Stevens investigated the site and found evidence that several bears had been feeding on contaminated materials left behind by the drug operation. "We found the remains of at least 2 other bears in the area," Stevens reported. "Both showed signs of chemical poisoning. This particular bear was probably the largest and strongest, which is why it survived long enough to make it to town." The financial cost of the bear's rampage was staggering. The destroyed equipment in the police armory was valued at over $800,000, and the damage to the building itself added another $400,000 to the total. Insurance claims and legal fees pushed the final cost to over $1.2 million. Mayor Catherine Walsh found herself dealing with a media circus that descended on Homer in the days following the incident. News crews from around the world arrived to cover the story of the drug-crazed bear that had destroyed a police station. The small town's infrastructure was overwhelmed by the attention. "We've had journalists from CNN, BBC, Japanese television, and about 20 other networks," Walsh told reporters during a press conference 5 days after the incident. "Homer's never seen anything like this, and frankly, we're not equipped to handle this level of media attention." The story became an international sensation, with footage of the destroyed police station being broadcast on every major network. Social media exploded with memes and jokes about the meth bear. But for the people of Homer, the incident was no laughing matter. The Homer Police Department was forced to operate out of temporary facilities while their building was repaired and their armory was restocked. Federal emergency funds were allocated to cover the costs, but the bureaucratic process of obtaining the money and ordering replacement equipment took months. Officer Linda Wright underwent 12 surgeries over the course of 8 months. The damage to her left arm was so extensive that doctors considered amputation, but Linda fought to keep the limb. Her determination and the skill of her surgical team eventually paid off. though she never regained full use of the arm. "I'm alive, and that's what matters," Linda told reporters during an interview 6 months after the attack. "Paul Keating saved my life, and I'll never forget that. As for my arm, well, it works well enough for me to still do my job, just differently." Linda returned to duty after 14 months of rehabilitation, but she was transferred to administrative duties within the department. The psychological impact of the attack had been as severe as the physical injuries, and she underwent counseling for post-traumatic stress disorder. Paul Keating was decorated for his heroism in saving Linda's life, but he struggled with survivors' guilt and nightmares about the incident. He took early retirement from the police force 18 months later and moved to Arizona, where he works as a security consultant. "I still wake up some nights hearing that bear roar," Paul admitted during a follow-up interview 2 years after the incident. "People call me a hero, but I don't feel like one. I feel like I got lucky, and Linda paid the price for my decision to go into that building." Chief Robert Brennan implemented new protocols for wildlife encounters following the incident. The Homer Police Department now maintains tranquilizer equipment and receives regular training from Alaska Department of Fish and Game personnel. "We learned a hard lesson," Brennan said during a training session for regional law enforcement agencies. "Wildlife encounters in Alaska are unpredictable, and we need to be prepared for scenarios that go beyond normal parameters." Dr. Sarah Mackenzie published several scientific papers based on her observations of the bear's behavior during the incident. Her research contributed to a better understanding of how illegal drugs affect wildlife and led to new protocols for investigating and cleaning up abandoned drug laboratories. "This incident represents a new category of human-wildlife conflict," Dr. Mackenzie wrote in the Journal of Wildlife Management. "As illegal drug production expands into remote areas, we can expect to see more cases of wildlife being exposed to dangerous chemicals. The Homer incident should serve as a wake-up call for law enforcement and wildlife management agencies." The abandoned methamphetamine laboratory that had poisoned the bear was cleaned up by a hazardous materials team at a cost of over $200,000. State environmental officials found contamination extending over several acres, including groundwater and soil that will require monitoring for years to come. 3 men were eventually arrested and charged in connection with the drug laboratory. Robert Bobby Kowalski, 34, Trevor Martinez, 28, and Dennis Flynn, 41, all pleaded guilty to federal drug manufacturing charges and environmental crimes. They were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 to 12 years. These defendants showed complete disregard for public safety and the environment, said federal prosecutor Janet Liu during the sentencing hearing. Their illegal activities led directly to the poisoning of wildlife and endangered the lives of law enforcement officers and civilians. The Homer Bear incident became a case study in law enforcement academies across the country, illustrating the unexpected ways that drug crimes can impact communities. Police departments in rural areas with illegal drug activity began developing new protocols for dealing with contaminated wildlife. The rebuilt Homer Police Department Armory incorporated new security features designed to prevent similar incidents. The building was reinforced, and the armory was relocated to a more secure section of the facility. Motion sensors and improved locking systems were installed to provide early warning of any intrusion attempts. Margaret Chen, the dispatcher who coordinated the emergency response, received a commendation for her professionalism during the crisis. She remained at her post throughout the incident, maintaining communications with emergency responders, even as the building shook around her. "I was scared, but I knew that the officers and emergency responders were depending on me to keep the communications open," Chen said during an interview. "It's what we train for, even if we never expect to use that training in a situation like this." The incident had long-lasting effects on the Homer community. Property values in the downtown area declined temporarily as people worried about future wildlife encounters. Several businesses relocated to other parts of town, and the city implemented new building codes designed to make structures more resistant to wildlife intrusion. Tourism to Homer initially declined as visitors worried about dangerous wildlife, but eventually rebounded as the story of the Homer bear became part of local folklore. Gift shops began selling T-shirts and souvenirs commemorating the incident, much to the dismay of city officials and the officers who had lived through it. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the surgeon who operated on Linda Wright, became an advocate for better emergency medical preparedness in rural Alaska communities. She testified before the state legislature about the need for improved trauma care capabilities in remote areas. Officer Wright was lucky that we had a helicopter available and good weather conditions, Dr. Morrison told lawmakers. In many cases, victims of wildlife attacks in rural Alaska don't have access to the level of trauma care they need. We need to invest in medical infrastructure that can serve these communities. The incident also led to changes in how illegal drug laboratories are investigated and cleaned up. State and federal agencies developed new protocols for assessing environmental damage and wildlife contamination at abandoned drug sites. Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation scientist Lisa Park led the development of these new protocols. The Homer bear incident showed us that we need to think beyond human health and safety when we're dealing with drug lab cleanup, Park said. Wildlife can be severely affected by chemical contamination, and those effects can eventually impact human communities. 5 years after the incident, the Homer Police Department conducted a memorial service to mark the anniversary of the attack. Linda Wright, who had returned to full duty despite her ongoing physical limitations, spoke about the importance of supporting law enforcement officers who suffer traumatic injuries. "What happened to me could happen to any officer anywhere," Wright said during the memorial service. "We face dangers every day that the general public never sees. The support I received from this community and from my fellow officers made all the difference in my recovery." Paul Keating flew in from Arizona to attend the memorial service, marking his first return to Homer since his retirement. He visited the rebuilt police station and the memorial plaque that had been installed to commemorate the incident. "It seems like a lifetime ago," Keating said as he stood in the rebuilt armory. "But I still remember every detail of that morning. Some things you never forget, no matter how much time passes." The bear's mounted head and pelt were eventually displayed in the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center in Portage, along with an educational exhibit about the dangers of wildlife exposure to illegal drugs. The display attracts thousands of visitors each year and serves as a reminder of the unexpected ways that human activities can impact wildlife. Chief Robert Brennan retired in 2029, 4 years after the bear incident. During his retirement ceremony, he reflected on how the incident had changed the department and the community. "That bear taught us that we can never be completely prepared for everything nature might throw at us," Brennan said, "but we can be ready to respond with courage and professionalism when the unexpected happens." Paul Keating and Linda Wright showed exactly that kind of courage, and their actions saved lives. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie continued her research into human-wildlife conflicts, with particular focus on the effects of environmental contamination on animal behavior. Her work contributed to better understanding of how illegal drug operations impact ecosystems and wildlife populations. The Homer bear was an extreme example, but it's part of a larger pattern we're seeing across North America, Dr. Mackenzie said during a conference presentation in 2030. As illegal drug production moves into remote areas, we're seeing more cases of wildlife exposure to dangerous chemicals. We need to be proactive in addressing these issues before we have more incidents like Homer. The methamphetamine laboratory site, where the bear had been exposed to drugs, was eventually cleaned up and converted into a wildlife research station. The facility, operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, conducts ongoing research into environmental contamination and wildlife health. Dr. Robert Chen, the veterinary pathologist who examined the bear's carcass, used tissue samples from the animal in his research into the effects of illegal drugs on wildlife. His work led to the development of new techniques for detecting drug exposure in wild animals. The Homer bear provided us with unique insights into how methamphetamine affects large predators, Dr. Chen said. The brain damage we documented was unlike anything we had seen before. It helped us understand why the bear exhibited such unusual and dangerous behavior. The incident became the subject of several books and documentaries, including a National Geographic special that aired in 2027. The documentary featured interviews with all the surviving participants and dramatic recreations of the bear attack. Linda Wright served as a consultant on the documentary, helping to ensure that the recreation was accurate and respectful to those who had been involved. She remained with the Homer Police Department until her retirement in 2035, eventually rising to the rank of sergeant. People often ask me if I regret going into law enforcement after what happened, Wright said during her retirement ceremony. The answer is absolutely not. What happened to me was traumatic, but it also showed me the strength of the human spirit and the importance of the work we do. The rebuilt Homer Police Department Armory was designed to be one of the most secure facilities of its kind in Alaska. The new design incorporated lessons learned from the bear incident and from other wildlife encounters documented around the state. Architect Jennifer Mason, who designed the new facility, incorporated multiple layers of security and structural reinforcement. We had to assume that any large predator that might encounter this building would be operating outside normal behavioral parameters, Mason explained. The design had to account for the worst-case scenario. The Homer bear incident influenced wildlife management policies across Alaska and other states with large predator populations. New protocols were developed for dealing with wildlife that had been exposed to illegal drugs or other contaminants. Alaska Department of Fish and Game Director Thomas Rodriguez implemented new training programs for wildlife officers and local law enforcement. The Homer incident showed us that we need to expect the unexpected when dealing with wildlife, Rodriguez said. Traditional bear management techniques might not work when the animal has been chemically altered. By 2030, 5 years after the incident, Homer had largely recovered from the trauma and disruption caused by the bear attack. The rebuilt police station was fully operational, property values had returned to normal, and tourism had rebounded. But the memory of that April morning remained vivid for those who had lived through it. Mayor Catherine Walsh, who had coordinated the city's response to the crisis, reflected on the incident during a town meeting in 2030. What happened here was unprecedented, and hopefully it will never happen again, Walsh said. But it showed us what this community is capable of when we work together in the face of crisis. The Homer bear incident remains unique in the annals of law enforcement and wildlife management. No similar case has been documented anywhere in North America, though several potential incidents involving drug-exposed wildlife have been prevented through better laboratory cleanup procedures and wildlife monitoring. The legacy of the incident continues through the ongoing work of the researchers, law enforcement officers, and medical professionals who were involved in the response. Their experiences on that April morning in 2025 contributed to better preparation for future human-wildlife conflicts and improved understanding of the complex ways that human activities can impact wildlife populations. Linda Wright, now retired and living in Homer, occasionally gives presentations to law enforcement groups about her experience. Her message is always the same: preparation, training, and teamwork are essential, but sometimes courage and luck make all the difference. I survived that bear attack because Paul Keating was willing to risk his life to save mine, Wright always tells her audiences. That's what law enforcement is all about. We take care of each other, no matter what the cost. That bear taught me a lot about fear and courage, but Paul Keating taught me even more about what it means to be a police officer. The Homer Bear incident of April 12, 2025 remains one of the most unusual and dramatic wildlife encounters in Alaska history. The combination of illegal drug activity, wildlife contamination, and human courage created a perfect storm that tested everyone involved. The $1.2 million in damage caused by one drug-crazed Kodiak bear served as an expensive reminder of the unexpected ways that criminal activity can impact entire communities. Today, the rebuilt Homer Police Department stands as a testament to the resilience of the community and the dedication of the men and women who serve in law enforcement. The incident changed everyone involved, but it also demonstrated the strength that emerges when people face extraordinary challenges with courage and determination. The bear that caused so much destruction is gone, but its legacy continues in the improved procedures, better training, and stronger community bonds that emerged from that terrifying April morning. In the end, the Homer Bear incident became more than just a story of destruction and survival. It became a story of how a small Alaska community came together to overcome an unprecedented crisis and emerge stronger than before. The next stories, January 10th, 2025. Bear mauls 68-year-old teacher outside rural school in Wyoming. Margaret Eleanor Hill had always believed in the sanctity of routine. For 37 years, she had risen each morning at 5:30, prepared her coffee with exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar and a splash of cream, and reviewed her lesson plans before heading to Moose Creek Elementary School. Even now, 3 years into retirement, her internal clock remained unwavering. On this particular Friday morning, January 10th, 2025, Margaret's routine had been altered by a single phone call that would set in motion a chain of events that would forever scar the small community of Moose Creek, Wyoming, population 843. The call had come at 6:47 in the morning from her daughter-in-law, Sarah Hill, whose voice carried the particular strain that mothers develop when juggling multiple crises simultaneously. 8-year-old Timothy Hill, Margaret's grandson, had awakened with what appeared to be the beginning stages of a stomach bug. But Sarah, a registered nurse at the county hospital, was already covering an extra shift due to a colleague's unexpected absence. Margaret's son, David, was 3 hours away in Cheyenne, attending a mandatory training session for his work with the Wyoming Department of Transportation. Could Margaret possibly pick up Timothy from school if he needed to come home early? "Of course, dear," Margaret had replied, her voice carrying the warmth that had comforted thousands of students over the decades. "I'll be there the moment they call." Margaret Hill stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with silver hair she kept in a neat bob and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. At 68, she maintained the posture and energy of someone 20 years younger, a testament to her daily walks along the Moose Creek Trail and her insistence on tending her own garden. She had taught 2nd grade for most of her career, though she had filled in for other grades when needed and was beloved by generations of families in the area. Children who had been in her class 30 years ago now brought their own children to meet Mrs. Hill, and she remembered every single name, birthday, and favorite subject. The Moose Creek Elementary School sat on the western edge of town, a single-story brick building constructed in 1978 to serve the growing population of families drawn to the area by logging and later ecotourism. The building housed grades kindergarten through 6th, with a total enrollment of 112 students. Principal Janet Martinez had been at the school for 15 years and knew Margaret Hill as both a colleague and friend. The school was surrounded by a modest playground on the south side, a gravel parking area on the east, and bordered the Shoshone National Forest on the north and west sides. The forest boundary was marked by a simple chain-link fence, 4 feet high and topped with a single strand of barbed wire, installed in 1994 after a minor incident involving a curious black bear that had wandered onto the playground during recess. The fence had been deemed adequate by both school district officials and Wyoming Game and Fish Department representatives, as serious bear encounters in the immediate vicinity had been extremely rare. The nearest documented grizzly sighting had been 12 miles north, along the upper reaches of Moose Creek, and that had been 3 years prior. What the various authorities did not know was that the winter of 2024 had been particularly harsh, with snowfall reaching record levels and temperatures remaining below zero for extended periods. The severe weather had disrupted the normal hibernation patterns of several animals, including a 430-pound male grizzly bear, known to wildlife biologists as bear number 379. This bear, approximately 12 years old and in his prime, had emerged from hibernation nearly a month early due to a disturbance in his den site caused by an avalanche in late December. Bear number 379 had been tracked intermittently by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department since 2021, when he was first captured and fitted with a GPS collar as part of a research study on grizzly bear movement patterns in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The data from his collar showed typical behavior for most of the study period. Seasonal movements between high-elevation summer ranges and lower-elevation winter denning sites, with occasional forays into developed areas in search of anthropogenic food sources. However, since his premature emergence, his movement patterns had become increasingly erratic. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist with the University of Wyoming who had been monitoring the bear's collar data, would later testify that in the 2 weeks preceding January 10th, Bear 379 had been moving in a roughly circular pattern with a diameter of approximately 15 miles, centered on the Moose Creek drainage. This behavior was consistent with a bear experiencing high stress levels and searching for food sources. The bear had lost significant body weight during his extended active period, dropping from his pre-hibernation weight of 465 pounds to his current weight of 430 pounds. On the morning of January 10th, Bear 379 was approximately 2 miles north of Moose Creek Elementary School, in a dense stand of lodgepole pine that provided cover and windbreak. The temperature was -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light snow falling and winds gusting to 15 miles per hour from the northwest. The bear had not eaten in 4 days, having been unsuccessful in locating the carcass of an elk he had scented, but lost track of due to the weather conditions. Margaret Hill was unaware of any of this as she prepared for her day. After receiving Sarah's call, she had maintained her normal routine, showering, dressing in her favorite navy blue wool sweater and grey slacks, and eating a light breakfast of toast and jam. She checked her phone twice during the morning, expecting to hear from the school, but Timothy had apparently rallied and made it through his morning classes without incident. At 11:30 in the morning, the anticipated call finally came. Jennifer Walsh, the school secretary, explained that Timothy was feeling nauseated and had asked to go home. Could Margaret come to pick him up? Margaret assured Jennifer she would be there within 15 minutes and gathered her keys, purse, and the thick winter coat that had belonged to her late husband, Robert. Robert Hill had passed away 18 months prior from complications related to diabetes, and Margaret had taken to wearing his old red and black plaid wool coat during the coldest weather as a way of feeling connected to him. The drive to Moose Creek Elementary took Margaret exactly 12 minutes, covering the 4.3 miles of rural highway and side roads that connected her small ranch-style home to the school. She had made this trip thousands of times during her teaching career and could navigate it in any weather condition. The roads were clear despite the morning snow, thanks to the diligent work of the county maintenance crew, and Margaret arrived at the school parking lot at 11:57. The school building appeared quiet from the outside as classes were still in session. Margaret parked her silver Honda Civic in the visitor's space closest to the main entrance and noted that there were only 3 other vehicles in the lot. Principal Martinez's blue Ford Explorer, Mrs. Chen's white Toyota Camry, Mrs. Chen taught 4th grade, and a red pickup truck that she didn't immediately recognize but assumed belonged to a maintenance worker or substitute teacher. Margaret had intended to go directly into the building to retrieve Timothy, but as she stepped out of her car, she noticed movement in the tree line beyond the playground. Her first thought was that it might be a deer, as white-tailed deer were common in the area and often grazed near the school grounds in the early morning and late afternoon hours. She paused, her hand on the car door, and squinted toward the forest boundary. The movement was subtle, a shifting of shadows among the pine trees that bordered the playground's western edge. Margaret's eyesight was not what it had been in her younger years, despite her glasses, and she found herself taking several steps away from her car to get a better view. The snow was falling more steadily now, creating a curtain of white that made it difficult to distinguish shapes among the trees. Inside the school, Timothy Hill was sitting in the nurse's station, which consisted of a single room with 2 cots, a desk, and basic medical supplies. School nurse Patricia Pat Williams, a robust woman in her 50s who had been with the district for 8 years, was taking Timothy's temperature for the 2nd time in an hour. At 8 years old, Timothy was small for his age, with his grandmother's brown eyes and his father's unruly dark hair. He was a bright child who loved mathematics and reading, and he was particularly close to his grandmother Margaret, whom he called Grandma Maggie. "It's still normal," Pat told Timothy, looking at the digital thermometer. 98.4. "How's your tummy feeling now?" Timothy considered the question seriously as he approached most things in life. "A little better, I think, but I still feel kind of yucky." Pat nodded understandingly. She had seen hundreds of cases of childhood stomach upset, and in her experience, sometimes the best medicine was simply going home to rest in familiar surroundings. She had already called Timothy's emergency contact, his grandmother Margaret, and was expecting her arrival at any moment. "Your grandma should be here soon," Pat said, checking her watch. "Why don't you rest here for a few more minutes?" Timothy nodded and lay back on the small cot, pulling the thin school blanket up to his chin. Through the single window in the nurse's station, he could see across the hallway to the main entrance of the school. He was looking forward to seeing Grandma Maggie and spending the afternoon at her house, where she would make him chamomile tea with honey and let him watch nature documentaries on her old television set. Meanwhile, in the 3rd grade classroom at the opposite end of the building, teacher Amanda Foster was leading her 18 students through their afternoon math lesson. Amanda, 28 years old and in her 5th year of teaching, had grown up in Moose Creek and had been one of Margaret Hill's students 20 years earlier. She was a petite woman with curly red hair and freckles, known for her endless energy and creative teaching methods. "Can anyone tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" Amanda asked the class, looking around the room for raised hands. Several students responded enthusiastically, and Amanda was about to continue with the lesson when she noticed something that made her pause. Through the large windows that faced the playground and forest, she could see a figure standing in the parking lot, an older woman in a red and black coat who appeared to be looking toward the trees. Amanda recognized Margaret Hill immediately, as the retired teacher was a familiar sight around the school and often volunteered for special events. Amanda glanced at the clock on her classroom wall. It was 12:03 in the afternoon. She wondered if Mrs. Hill was there to pick up a sick student, which would explain why she was standing outside rather than coming directly into the building. Amanda was about to return her attention to the math lesson when something about Margaret's posture struck her as odd. The older woman was standing very still, her body angled toward the forest, and she appeared to be focused intently on something among the trees. At that same moment, in the kindergarten classroom on the south side of the building, teacher Rebecca Martinez, no relation to the principal, was helping her 15 students prepare for lunch. Rebecca, 34 years old with shoulder-length brown hair and a master's degree in early childhood education, had been teaching for 10 years and was known for her calm demeanor and ability to handle even the most energetic 5- and 6-year-olds. The kindergarten classroom had large windows that faced the playground, providing an excellent view of the swing sets, slide, and climbing equipment that the children used during their twice-daily recess periods. Rebecca was helping little Emma Peterson tie her shoes when she happened to glance out the window and saw Margaret Hill standing in the parking lot. Rebecca knew Margaret well, as Margaret had been her mentor during Rebecca's student teaching experience a decade earlier. She watched with mild curiosity as Margaret took several steps away from her car, apparently looking at something in the forest. Rebecca's first thought was that Margaret might have spotted one of the deer that occasionally visited the school grounds, and she considered pointing it out to her students, who always enjoyed seeing wildlife. However, as Rebecca continued to observe, she began to feel a sense of unease that she couldn't immediately identify. There was something about Margaret's body language, the way she was standing so still, the tension in her shoulders, the forward lean of her posture, that suggested she was not looking at something benign like a grazing deer. In the school's main office, Secretary Jennifer Walsh was finishing up a phone call with a parent when she noticed through the office window that Timothy Hill's grandmother had arrived. Jennifer had worked at the school for 6 years and knew Margaret Hill both professionally and personally. She could see Margaret standing near her car, apparently looking toward the playground area. Jennifer completed her phone call and made a note in Timothy's file about his early dismissal. She then picked up the phone to call the nurse's station and let Pat know that Mrs. Hill had arrived. However, as she dialed the extension, she continued to watch Margaret through the window and noticed that the older woman had now moved several more steps away from her car and was standing near the edge of the playground area. "Pat, this is Jennifer," she said when the nurse answered. "Mrs. Hill is here for Timothy. She's outside in the parking area." "Great. I'll send him out in just a minute," Pat replied. "His temperature is normal, and he says he's feeling a bit better." Jennifer was about to hang up when she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Among the trees at the western edge of the playground, approximately 50 yards from where Margaret was standing, she could see what appeared to be a large, dark shape moving slowly through the pine trees. At first, she thought it might be a shadow cast by the swaying branches, but as she watched more carefully, she realized that the shape was moving independently of the wind. "Pat," Jennifer said, her voice suddenly tight, "can you hold on a second? I think there might be an animal in the trees near the playground." Jennifer set the phone down and moved closer to the office window, pressing her face against the glass to get a better view. The snow was falling more heavily now, creating a gauzy curtain that made it difficult to see clearly into the forest. But there was definitely something there, something large and dark that was moving with purpose rather than the random swaying of vegetation. Jennifer had lived in Wyoming her entire life and had encountered various wildlife, including black bears on several occasions. However, something about this situation felt different. The shape among the trees was larger than any black bear she had ever seen, and its movement pattern was deliberate and focused, rather than the casual wandering typical of a bear foraging for food. Bear number 3. 379 had been watching the school building for nearly 20 minutes before Margaret Hill arrived. From his position in the dense pine forest, he had an unobstructed view of the playground and parking area. The bear's exceptional sense of smell had detected the presence of humans long before he could see them, and his hearing had picked up the sounds of children's voices and adult conversation filtering through the school building's walls and windows. In his current state of stress and hunger, Bear 379 was operating on instincts that had been honed by millions of years of evolution. His primary drive was to find food, but the presence of humans created a complex set of behavioral responses. Under normal circumstances, a healthy, well-fed grizzly bear would avoid human contact whenever possible. However, Bear 379 was neither healthy nor well-fed, and his judgment was impaired by the physiological stress of prolonged hunger and disrupted hibernation. The bear's attention was initially focused on the building itself, as the scents emanating from within suggested the presence of food. However, when Margaret Hill stepped out of her car and began moving away from the vehicle, the bear's focus shifted entirely to her. From the bear's perspective, Margaret represented both a potential threat and a potential opportunity. Her isolated position, away from the building and other humans, made her an accessible target. Bear 379 began moving slowly through the trees, using the natural cover of the forest to mask his approach. His massive paws made virtually no sound on the snow-covered ground, and his dark brown fur blended perfectly with the shadows among the pine trees. The bear moved with the fluid grace that belied his enormous size, covering ground at a pace that appeared leisurely but was actually quite rapid. As the bear moved closer to the edge of the forest, he could smell Margaret's scent more clearly. The combination of soap, perfume, and the natural human odor created a complex olfactory signature that the bear's brain processed and catalogued. More importantly, the bear could detect no scent markers that indicated Margaret was armed or posed a significant threat. To Bear 379, she appeared to be a solitary, vulnerable human who had separated herself from the safety of the group. Margaret Hill, still standing approximately 15 feet from her car, continued to peer into the forest. Her human eyesight, already limited by age and atmospheric conditions, was no match for the bear's ability to remain concealed among the trees. She could sense that something was moving in the forest, but she had not yet identified what it was or where exactly it was located. The wind was blowing from the northwest, which meant that Margaret's scent was being carried directly toward the bear, while the bear's scent was being blown away from her. This natural phenomenon, which wildlife biologists call scent shadowing, meant that Margaret had no olfactory warning of the predator's presence. Her human hearing, while adequate for normal conversation, was not sensitive enough to detect the bear's nearly silent approach through the forest. As Margaret took another step forward, trying to get a better view of whatever was moving among the trees, she was now approximately 25 yards from the forest edge and 40 yards from her car. From a tactical perspective, she had placed herself in an extremely vulnerable position, isolated from shelter and help, with her back partially turned to the school building where potential rescuers might be located. Inside the school, the various staff members and students who had noticed Margaret's presence were beginning to feel varying levels of concern. Jennifer Walsh, still standing at the office window with the phone receiver in her hand, was trying to get a clearer view of what she had seen moving in the trees. The falling snow and the shadows created by the pine forest made it extremely difficult to distinguish between natural forest movement and the presence of an animal. "Pat, are you still there?" Jennifer said into the phone. "Yes, I'm here," Pat replied from the nurse's station. "What's going on?" "I think there might be a bear in the trees near the playground," Jennifer said, her voice betraying her growing anxiety. "Mrs. Hill is standing outside, and I don't think she realizes it's there." Pat set down the medical chart she had been updating and moved to the single window in the nurse's station. However, the nurse's station was located on the east side of the building and did not have a view of the playground or parking area. "I can't see anything from here," Pat said. "Are you sure it's a bear?" Jennifer pressed her face closer to the window, trying to penetrate the veil of falling snow and forest shadows. "I'm not 100% sure, but there's definitely something large moving in the trees, and it's not moving like a deer or elk." In the third-grade classroom, Amanda Foster had also noticed Margaret's continued presence in the parking area and was beginning to feel concerned. She had paused her math lesson and was now standing at the window, ostensibly supervising her students, but actually watching Margaret's movements with growing unease. "Mrs. Foster, what are you looking at?" asked Jeremy Thompson, one of her more observant students. "Nothing important, Jeremy," Amanda replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "Just checking on something outside. Let's continue with our math problems." However, Amanda continued to watch as Margaret took yet another step toward the forest. From her classroom window, Amanda had a clearer view of the tree line than Jennifer had from the office, and she was beginning to see what appeared to be a large, dark shape moving slowly through the trees. The shape was approximately the same height as the surrounding undergrowth, but it was moving in a way that suggested it was not vegetation being blown by the wind. Amanda glanced at the clock on her classroom wall. It was now 12:07 in the afternoon. She faced a dilemma that teachers occasionally encounter. Should she interrupt her class and potentially cause panic, or should she continue teaching while keeping an eye on the situation outside? She decided on a middle course of action. "Class, I need you to continue working on problems 1 through 10. On page 47, Amanda announced. "I'm going to step into the hallway for just a moment to speak with Mrs. Martinez." Amanda left her classroom and walked quickly down the hallway toward the main office. As she passed other classrooms, she could see that several teachers were also looking out their windows toward the playground area. The entire school seemed to be developing a collective sense of unease about something happening outside. Bear number 379 was now within 30 yards of the forest edge, directly upwind from Margaret Hill. The bear could smell her scent clearly, and his hunting instincts were fully engaged. The bear's heart rate had increased, and his muscles were tensed for action. From his position behind a large pine tree, he had an unobstructed view of Margaret and could see that she was alone and focused on trying to see into the forest. The bear's brain was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. His exceptional hearing detected the sounds of human voices from within the school building, indicating that there were other humans nearby who might pose a threat or interfere with any action he might take. However, his visual assessment of the immediate area showed that Margaret was isolated, and that the distance between her position and the school building would provide him with sufficient time to approach her before others could respond. Bear 379's behavior was now being driven by a combination of predatory instinct and opportunistic assessment. The bear recognized that Margaret represented a potential food source, but more importantly, his stress-addled brain was interpreting her isolated position as a sign that she was weak or separated from her group, classic indicators that predators use to identify vulnerable prey. The bear began his final approach, moving from tree to tree with the practiced stealth of an apex predator. Each movement brought him several yards closer to Margaret, and each step increased the likelihood that their encounter would end in tragedy. The bear's powerful leg muscles were coiled like springs, ready to propel his 430-pound body forward at speeds that could reach 35 miles per hour. Margaret Hill, still standing in the falling snow and trying to identify what she had seen moving among the trees, remained completely unaware that she was being stalked by one of North America's most formidable predators. Her attention was focused on the wrong area of the forest, as the bear had successfully used natural cover to approach from a slightly different angle than where she had first noticed movement. The snow continued to fall at a steady rate, accumulating on Margaret's shoulders and glasses, further limiting her already compromised vision. The temperature had dropped to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was gusting more strongly, creating a white noise that masked the subtle sounds that might have warned her of the approaching danger. At 12:09, Margaret made a decision that would prove to be fatal. Frustrated by her inability to clearly see what was moving in the forest, she took 3 more steps toward the tree line, bringing herself within 20 yards of where Bear 379 was concealed. From the bear's perspective, Margaret had now moved close enough to be considered within striking range. The bear's hunting sequence was triggered by Margaret's forward movement. In the wild, prey animals that move toward a predator rather than away often do so because they are sick, injured, or otherwise compromised, making them ideal targets. Bear 379's predatory instincts interpreted Margaret's approach as confirmation that she was vulnerable. Inside the school, Jennifer Walsh had made a decision. Her growing concern about the situation outside overcame her uncertainty about what she had seen in the forest. She hung up the phone and walked quickly down the hallway toward Principal Janet Martinez's office. Janet was an experienced administrator who had dealt with various wildlife encounters during her 15 years at the school, and Jennifer felt that the principal needed to be informed about the potential presence of a bear near the playground. "Janet, I think we might have a situation outside," Jennifer said as she entered the principal's office. "Mrs. Hill is here to pick up Timothy, but she's standing in the parking area, and I think there might be a bear in the trees near the playground." Principal Martinez immediately looked up from the budget reports she had been reviewing. At 53 years old, Janet had the kind of calm authority that comes from years of managing both routine school operations and unexpected crises. She had dealt with everything from power outages to medical emergencies, and she had developed a reputation for making quick, sound decisions under pressure. "Show me," Janet said, rising from her desk and following Jennifer back to the main office window. The 2 women stood at the window, looking out at the parking area where Margaret Hill was clearly visible in her red and black coat. Margaret was now standing quite close to the forest edge, and both women could see that she appeared to be looking intently at something among the trees. "There," Jennifer said, pointing toward a section of forest approximately 40 yards to the left of where Margaret was looking. "I keep seeing something moving in that area. It's too big to be a deer, and it's moving too deliberately to be branches in the wind." Principal Martinez studied the tree line carefully. As a long-time resident of Wyoming, she had encountered various wildlife, including both black bears and grizzly bears. She knew that bears occasionally wandered near developed areas, especially during times when their normal food sources were scarce. However, a bear near a school during class time represented a serious safety threat that required immediate action. "I think you're right," Janet said after watching for nearly a minute. "We need to get Mrs. Hill inside immediately and secure the building." Janet picked up the phone on Jennifer's desk and dialed the number for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's emergency wildlife hotline. While the phone was ringing, she continued to watch Margaret through the window, hoping that the older woman would decide to come inside the building on her own. The call was answered on the 3rd ring by dispatch operator Carol Stevens, a 20-year veteran who had handled hundreds of wildlife emergency calls. "Wyoming Game and Fish, this is Carol." "This is Janet Martinez, principal at Moose Creek Elementary School," Janet said, speaking quickly but clearly. "We have what appears to be a bear in the forest adjacent to our playground, and we have a civilian in the area who may be in danger." "What type of bear are we talking about, and how close is it to people?" Carol asked. immediately shifting into emergency protocol mode. "We're not sure if it's a black bear or grizzly," Janet replied. "It's in the tree line about 20 to 30 yards from our playground, and we have a woman standing in our parking lot who appears to be unaware of its presence." Carol Stevens was already pulling up the GPS coordinates for Moose Creek Elementary School on her computer system, while simultaneously dispatching an alert to game and fish officers in the area. "Ma'am, you need to get that person inside immediately and initiate lockdown procedures for your school. Do not send anyone outside and do not allow anyone to leave the building." "Understood," Janet said. "We're going to try to get her attention now." Janet handed the phone to Jennifer and moved quickly toward the school's main entrance. The front door was equipped with an electronic lock system that allowed staff to control access to the building, and Janet knew that she could open the door and call out to Margaret without fully exposing herself to whatever was in the forest. However, as Janet reached for the door handle, she was stopped by a sight that made her blood run cold. Through the glass panels beside the main entrance, she could see that Margaret Hill was no longer alone in the parking area. Bear number 379 had emerged from the tree line. The massive grizzly bear was now in full view, standing approximately 15 yards behind Margaret and slightly to her left. The bear was moving slowly but purposefully toward her, and his body language indicated that he was in full predatory mode. His head was lowered, his ears were positioned forward, and his powerful shoulders were hunched in the characteristic posture of a bear preparing to attack. Margaret Hill, still focused on trying to see into the forest where she had originally noticed movement, remained completely unaware that the bear had emerged from the trees and was now approaching her from behind. The wind and falling snow continued to mask both the bear's scent and the subtle sounds of his movement across the snow-covered ground. "Oh my God," Janet whispered, her voice barely audible. She could see that Margaret was now in immediate, mortal danger, and she faced a split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Should she open the door and shout a warning to Margaret, potentially startling both the woman and the bear and triggering an attack? Or should she try to find another way to alert Margaret to the danger? Before Janet could make a decision, the situation escalated beyond anyone's control. Bear 379 had closed the distance to Margaret Hill to approximately 10 yards when his predatory sequence reached its culmination. The bear's instincts told him that the prey was positioned perfectly for a successful attack. She was isolated, unaware of his presence, and focused on something else. The bear gathered his powerful leg muscles and prepared to charge. At 12:11 and 37 seconds, bear number 379 launched his attack. The grizzly bear's charge covered the final 10 yards between himself and Margaret Hill in less than 2 seconds. The bear's massive body, weighing 430 pounds, moved with the explosive power that made grizzly bears one of the most formidable predators in North America. His powerful legs propelled him forward at a speed approaching 30 miles per hour, and his massive paws, each equipped with claws up to 4 inches long, struck the ground with tremendous force. Margaret Hill's first indication that she was in danger came when she heard the sound of the bear's paws hitting the ground behind her. The rhythmic pounding was unlike anything in her previous experience, and her brain struggled to process what she was hearing. She began to turn around, but Bear 379 was moving far too quickly for her to complete the movement. The bear struck Margaret from behind and slightly to the side, hitting her with the full force of his charge. The impact drove her to the ground immediately, and she landed face first in the snow with the bear's weight pressing down on her back. The force of the collision was equivalent to being struck by a small automobile, and Margaret lost consciousness almost instantly. Bear 379's attack continued with the methodical efficiency of a predator that had successfully brought down prey. The bear used his powerful jaws to grasp Margaret by the back of her neck, his canine teeth penetrating through her winter coat and the clothing beneath. The bear's bite force, which exceeded 1,500 pounds per square inch, crushed through skin, muscle and bone with devastating effect. Inside the school, the attack was witnessed by multiple people who would carry the traumatic memory for the rest of their lives. Principal Janet Martinez, still standing at the main entrance, watched in horror as the bear knocked Margaret to the ground and began mauling her. Janet's training and experience had not prepared her for witnessing such violence, and she found herself frozen with shock and disbelief. "Call 911. Janet shouted to Jennifer Walsh, who was still on the phone with the Wyoming Game and Fish dispatcher. "Call 911 right now." In the third-grade classroom, Amanda Foster had returned from her brief trip to the hallway just in time to witness the beginning of the attack through her classroom window. Amanda's first instinct was to protect her students from seeing the violence that was unfolding outside, but 18, 8, and 9-year-olds had also been looking out the window and had seen the bear emerge from the forest. "Mrs. Foster, there's a really big bear outside," shouted Kevin Martinez, no relation to the principal, pointing toward the window. Several other students began talking excitedly about the bear, but their excitement quickly turned to fear and confusion as they realized what was happening to the woman in the parking lot. Amanda made a quick decision that probably prevented even more psychological trauma for her young students. "Everyone away from the windows right now," Amanda said in her most authoritative voice. "Go sit at your desks and put your heads down on your arms. Do not look outside again until I tell you it's safe." Most of the students complied immediately, but a few continued to crane their necks toward the window, trying to see what was happening. Amanda quickly moved to the window and pulled down the shade, blocking the view of the attack. However, she continued to watch through a small gap in the shade, knowing that she might be called upon to provide witness testimony about what she had seen. In the kindergarten classroom, teacher Rebecca Martinez had also witnessed the beginning of the attack. However, her 15 kindergarten students were shorter than the third graders, and most of them could not see over the windowsill to the parking area. Rebecca quickly made the decision to move all of her students to the reading corner at the opposite end of the classroom, away from the windows. "We're going to have story time now," Rebecca announced, trying to keep her voice calm despite the horror she had just witnessed. "Everyone come sit on the carpet and I'll read you a special book." The kindergartners, unaware of the tragedy unfolding outside, happily moved to the reading area. Rebecca selected a picture book from the shelf, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold it open. She began reading in a voice that she hoped sounded normal, but her attention was focused on the sounds coming from outside the building. Bear number 3. 7-9 continued his attack on Margaret Hill for approximately 90 seconds, though to the witnesses inside the school, it seemed much longer. The bear used his teeth and claws to inflict massive trauma to Margaret's head, neck, and upper torso. The red and black wool coat that had belonged to her late husband was quickly torn to shreds, providing no protection against the bear's assault. Margaret Hill's injuries were catastrophic and immediately life-threatening. The bear's initial bite had crushed several cervical vertebrae and had severed the jugular vein on the left side of her neck. The massive blood loss and spinal cord damage meant that Margaret had lost consciousness within the first few seconds of the attack and was unlikely to regain consciousness. However, Bear 379 continued the attack, driven by instincts that had evolved over millions of years. The bear used his claws to rake across Margaret's back and shoulders, creating deep lacerations that penetrated through skin, muscle, and in some cases, bone. The bear's powerful jaw muscles allowed him to bite repeatedly, and each bite caused additional crushing injuries to Margaret's head and neck. Jennifer Walsh, following Principal Martinez's instructions, had hung up on the Wyoming Game and Fish dispatcher and had dialed 911. The call was answered by Teton County Emergency Dispatch Operator Michelle Thompson, a 15-year veteran who had handled hundreds of emergency calls but had never dealt with a bear attack. 911, what's your emergency? Michelle said. This is Moose Creek Elementary School, Jennifer said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and fear. We have a grizzly bear attacking someone in our parking lot. We need police and ambulances immediately. Michelle Thompson felt her own adrenaline surge as she processed Jennifer's words. Bear attacks were extremely rare in her jurisdiction, and she had to quickly shift mental gears from the routine traffic accidents and medical emergencies that comprised most of her workload. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and give me your exact location, Michelle said, while simultaneously dispatching alerts to sheriff's deputies, emergency medical services, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Moose Creek Elementary School, 1247 Forest Service Road, Jennifer replied. The bear is attacking an elderly woman in our parking lot right now. She's on the ground, and the bear is... Oh God, it's horrible. Michelle could hear the stress in Jennifer's voice and knew that the caller was witnessing something extremely traumatic. Ma'am, I need you to stay inside the building and keep everyone away from windows and doors. Do not go outside for any reason. I have deputies and EMS en route to your location. The nearest sheriff's deputy was Deputy Marcus Webb, a 12-year veteran of the Teton County Sheriff's Department, who was patrolling approximately 8 miles south of the school when the emergency call came in. Deputy Webb was an experienced outdoorsman who had grown up in Wyoming and was familiar with wildlife, including bears. However, he had never responded to an active bear attack. When the dispatch alert came over his radio at 12:13, Deputy Webb immediately activated his emergency lights and siren and began racing toward Moose Creek Elementary School. He estimated that it would take him approximately 6 minutes to reach the school, traveling at high speed on the rural roads. Deputy Webb used his radio to request backup and to alert Wyoming game and fish officers in the area. He also requested that the emergency helicopter be put on standby, as he suspected that there would be serious injuries requiring rapid transport to a trauma center. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Deputy Webb radioed. I'm en route to Moose Creek Elementary, ETA 6 minutes. Request backup units and game and fish response. Also request Flight for Life on standby. The emergency medical response was coordinated by Teton County EMS, with the nearest ambulance being stationed at the fire department in Moose Creek, approximately 4 miles from the school. The ambulance crew consisted of paramedic Lisa Chen, a 7-year veteran, and EMT Brad Johnson, who was in his 3rd year with the service. Lisa and Brad had been conducting routine equipment checks when the emergency alert came in at 12:13. Like Deputy Webb, they had never responded to a bear attack, but their training had covered various types of traumatic injuries, including animal attacks. Unit 4 responding to Moose Creek Elementary, bear attack with injuries, Lisa radioed as Brad activated the ambulance's emergency lights and siren. The ambulance's estimated arrival time was 5 minutes, putting them at the scene at approximately the same time as the first law enforcement officer. However, both responders knew that they would not be able to approach the victim until the area was secured and the bear was no longer a threat. Bear number 379's attack on Margaret Hill continued for another 30 seconds after the 911 call was placed. The bear's behavior during this phase of the attack was consistent with a predator that had successfully disabled its prey and was now asserting dominance over the kill. The bear used his massive weight to pin Margaret's body to the ground while continuing to inflict bite wounds to her head and neck. At 12:13 and 45 seconds, Bear 379 suddenly stopped his attack and raised his head, looking around the area with heightened alertness. The bear's exceptional hearing had detected the approaching sound of Deputy Webb's patrol car, still several miles away but audible to the bear's sensitive ears. The bear's instincts told him that other threats were approaching. and his behavior began to shift from predatory attack to defensive awareness. The bear stood over Margaret's motionless body, his massive head swiveling as he scanned the area for additional threats. Blood covered the bear's muzzle and front paws, and his breathing was heavy from the exertion of the attack. The bear's body language indicated that he was in a state of high arousal and ready to defend his kill from any challenges. Inside the school, Principal Janet Martinez had implemented the emergency lockdown procedures that had been developed for various threat scenarios. She used the school's intercom system to make an announcement that would be seared into the memories of everyone who heard it. "Attention all staff and students," Janet's voice said over the speakers, barely concealing the stress she was feeling. "We are implementing an immediate lockdown due to a wildlife emergency. All classroom doors should be locked, and everyone should remain away from windows and exterior doors until further notice." The announcement was heard by 112 students and 15 staff members throughout the school building. For most of the students, particularly the younger ones, the announcement was confusing rather than frightening. However, the teachers and other staff members understood the gravity of the situation and began implementing the lockdown procedures they had practiced during emergency drills. In the nurses' station, Pat Williams had been waiting for Margaret Hill to arrive and pick up Timothy when she heard the lockdown announcement. Pat immediately understood that something serious was happening, and she made the decision to keep Timothy with her rather than sending him to the main office as originally planned. "Timothy, honey, your grandmother is here, but we need to wait in this room for a little while before we can go see her," Pat told the 8-year-old boy. Timothy looked confused by this information. "Why can't I go see Grandma Maggie now?" Pat struggled to find words that would explain the situation without frightening the child. "There's just some excitement happening outside right now, and we need to wait until it's safe to go out there." Timothy accepted this explanation without further questions, but Pat could see that he was becoming more alert and interested in what might be happening outside. She made sure that Timothy remained seated on the cot, away from the single window in the nurses' station. Deputy Marcus Webb arrived at Moose Creek Elementary School at 12:18, exactly 5 minutes after receiving the emergency call. As he turned into the school's driveway, he could immediately see the scene in the parking area, a large grizzly bear standing over what appeared to be a human victim. The deputy's training kicked in immediately, and he began assessing the tactical situation. Deputy Webb parked his patrol car approximately 50 yards from the bear, positioning the vehicle to provide both cover and a clear line of sight to the animal. He immediately radioed his arrival and requested additional resources. "Dispatch Unit 7 on scene at Moose Creek Elementary. I have visual on a large grizzly bear with what appears to be a human victim. The bear is still active and poses an immediate threat. Request game and fish officers with tranquilizer capability and additional backup units." Deputy Webb was armed with a standard-issue Glock 22 pistol chambered in .40 caliber, which he knew would be inadequate for stopping a charging grizzly bear. His patrol car was also equipped with a Remington 870 shotgun loaded with 12-gauge slugs, which would be more effective but still not ideal for dealing with a large bear at close range. The deputy's priority was to secure the scene and prevent the bear from attacking additional victims. He could see movement in the school building's windows, indicating that there were people inside who might be at risk if the bear decided to approach the building. Bear number 3. 7-9 had been aware of the patrol car's arrival long before Deputy Webb could see the school. The bear's hearing had tracked the vehicle's approach, and his predatory instincts told him that a potential threat was getting closer. However, the bear's protective instincts regarding his kill were equally strong, and he was reluctant to abandon Margaret's body. The bear remained standing over Margaret, but his attention was now focused entirely on the patrol car and the human who had emerged from it. The bear's body language shifted to a more aggressive posture, with his head lowered and his ears flattened against his skull. The bear's mouth was open, revealing his massive canine teeth, which were stained with Margaret's blood. Deputy Webb recognized the bear's aggressive posture and knew that the situation was extremely dangerous. He remained behind his patrol car, using the vehicle as a barrier between himself and the bear. He drew his service weapon but kept it pointed toward the ground, as he knew that firing a pistol at a grizzly bear from 50 yards away would likely only wound the animal and make it even more aggressive. At 12:19, the Teton County EMS ambulance arrived at the scene, with paramedic Lisa Chen and EMT Brad Johnson quickly assessing the situation. Lisa had dealt with various types of traumatic injuries during her 7 years of service, but she had never faced a situation where the victim was being guarded by a dangerous predator. "Unit 4 on scene," Lisa radioed. "We have visual on the victim and the bear. The victim appears to be severely injured and unresponsive, unable to approach due to active threat from the bear." Lisa and Brad positioned their ambulance approximately 30 yards from Deputy Webb's patrol car, maintaining a safe distance from the bear while remaining ready to provide immediate medical attention once the area was secured. Both paramedics could see that Margaret Hill was in critical condition and would require immediate advanced life support measures if she was to have any chance of survival. The second law enforcement officer to arrive was Deputy Sarah McKinnon, a 5-year veteran who had been patrolling the northern part of the county when the bear attack call came in. Deputy McKinnon arrived at 12:21 and parked her patrol car adjacent to Deputy Webb's vehicle, creating a more formidable law enforcement presence. "Unit 12 on scene," Deputy McKinnon radioed. "Backing up Unit 7. What's the tactical situation?" Deputy Webb quickly briefed his colleague on what he had observed since arriving at the scene. The bear had not moved from its position over the victim, but it was clearly aware of the growing law enforcement presence and was becoming increasingly agitated. "The bear's been standing over the victim for about 3 minutes now," Deputy Webb explained. "It's aware of us, but it hasn't made any aggressive moves toward our position. The victim appears to be unconscious and severely injured." A Deputy McKinnon was equipped with similar weapons to Deputy Webb, and both officers understood that they were not optimally prepared for dealing with a large grizzly bear. However, they also knew that additional resources were en route, including Wyoming game and fish officers who would have specialized equipment for dealing with dangerous wildlife. At 12:23, Wyoming game and fish warden Tom Rodriguez arrived at the scene. Warden Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had extensive experience with bear encounters, including several situations involving aggressive bears that had posed threats to human safety. His vehicle was equipped with specialized equipment, including tranquilizer darts and a rifle capable of firing them accurately at distances up to 75 yards. "Game and fish on scene," Warden Rodriguez radioed as he assessed the situation. "I have tranquilizer capability. Request all other units maintain position and avoid any actions that might agitate the bear." Warden Rodriguez could immediately see that bear number 379 was a large, mature male grizzly in an extremely agitated state. The warden's experience told him that this bear was exhibiting classic predatory behavior and was unlikely to abandon its kill voluntarily. The bear would need to be either tranquilized or, if that proved unsuccessful, destroyed as a threat to public safety. "I'm going to attempt tranquilization," Warden Rodriguez announced over the radio. "All units be prepared for the bear to charge if the tranquilizer doesn't take effect immediately." Warden Rodriguez carefully removed his tranquilizer rifle from his vehicle and loaded it with a dart containing enough sedative to immobilize a bear of Bear 379's estimated size. The warden positioned himself behind his vehicle and took careful aim at the bear's shoulder area, which would provide the best target for effective drug delivery. "Bear number 3, 7-9 was acutely aware of the increasing human activity around him. The bear's predatory instincts were now in conflict with his survival instincts, as the presence of multiple potential threats suggested that maintaining his position over the kill might be more dangerous than retreating. However, the bear's hunger and the investment he had made in bringing down his prey made him reluctant to abandon Margaret's body. At 12:25 and 37 seconds, Warden Rodriguez fired the tranquilizer dart. The dart struck Bear 379 in the shoulder area, delivering its payload of sedative drugs directly into the bear's muscle tissue. However, the bear's reaction to being struck by the dart was immediate and violent. The bear let out a tremendous roar that could be heard inside the school building and began charging directly toward the law enforcement vehicles. A charging grizzly bear covering 50 yards of ground represents one of the most terrifying sights in the natural world. Bear 379's massive body moved with shocking speed and power, his four legs working in perfect coordination to propel him forward at nearly 30 miles per hour. His enormous head was lowered and his mouth was open, revealing the massive teeth that had just finished mauling Margaret Hill. "Bear's charging!" Deputy Webb shouted into his radio while simultaneously drawing his service weapon and preparing to fire. Warden Rodriguez knew that tranquilizer drugs required several minutes to take effect, and that Bear 379 would reach the law enforcement vehicles long before the sedatives could immobilize him. The warden dropped his tranquilizer rifle and grabbed a high-powered rifle chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, a caliber capable of stopping a charging grizzly bear with proper shot placement. The bear covered the first 25 yards of his charge in approximately 3 seconds, closing the distance between himself and the law enforcement officers at an alarming rate. Deputy Webb fired 3 rounds from his service pistol, but the .40 caliber bullets had minimal effect on the bear's massive body mass and thick hide. Deputy McKinnon also fired her service weapon, but like her colleague, she was using a caliber that was inadequate for stopping a charging grizzly bear. The pistol rounds struck the bear in the chest and shoulder area, but failed to significantly slow his advance. At a distance of 15 yards from the patrol cars, Warden Rodriguez fired his high-powered rifle. The .300 Winchester Magnum round struck Bear 379 in the upper chest area, delivering a devastating wound that finally began to slow the bear's charge. However, the bear's momentum carried him forward for several more yards before he collapsed approximately 8 feet from Deputy Webb's patrol car. Bear number 379's charge had lasted approximately 6 seconds and had covered nearly 40 yards. The bear's final collapse occurred at 12:26 and 14 seconds, exactly 3 minutes and 37 seconds after Margaret Hill had first been attacked. The bear lay on his side in the snow, breathing heavily, but no longer posing an immediate threat. The combination of the tranquilizer dart and the rifle shot had finally immobilized the animal, but all 3 officers maintained their positions behind their vehicles until they were certain the bear was no longer capable of further aggression. "Target down," Warden Rodriguez radioed. "Bear appears immobilized but still breathing. Maintaining overwatch until we can confirm the area is secure." The law enforcement officers waited an additional 2 minutes before cautiously approaching the immobilized bear. Warden Rodriguez used a long pole to prod the bear and confirm that it was unconscious and no longer responsive to external stimuli. Only after confirming that the bear posed no further threat did the officers allow the EMS personnel to approach Margaret Hill's body. Paramedic Lisa Chen and EMT Brad Johnson approached Margaret at 12:28, approximately 17 minutes after the initial attack had begun. Both paramedics were experienced in dealing with traumatic injuries, but the extent of Margaret's wounds was shocking even to these seasoned professionals. Margaret Hill was lying face down in snow that had been stained red with her blood. Her winter coat, had been completely destroyed by the bear's claws and teeth, and her clothing beneath was similarly shredded. The most immediately apparent injuries were to her head and neck area, where the bear's powerful jaws had inflicted massive crushing trauma. We have an elderly female, approximately 60 to 70 years old, with severe traumatic injuries to the head, neck, and upper torso, Lisa radioed to the emergency dispatch center. Patient is unresponsive and has no palpable pulse. Beginning CPR immediately. Lisa and Brad carefully turned Margaret's body over, revealing the full extent of her injuries. The bear's initial attack had crushed several bones in Margaret's face, and there were multiple deep lacerations on her scalp where the bear's claws had raked across her head. Most seriously, the bear's bite had severed Margaret's carotid artery, and she had lost a massive amount of blood. The paramedics began advanced life support measures, including CPR, endotracheal intubation, and the establishment of intravenous access for fluid resuscitation. However, both Lisa and Brad recognized that Margaret's injuries were likely fatal and that their efforts were probably futile given the extent of the trauma and the amount of time that had elapsed since the attack. Patient has been down for approximately 15 minutes with severe blood loss. Lisa updated the dispatch center. We're continuing resuscitation efforts, but the prognosis is grave. Request Flight for Life for immediate transport to trauma center. The Flight for Life helicopter, based at the Regional Medical Center in Jackson, had been placed on standby when the initial emergency call was received. The helicopter crew consisted of flight paramedic Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the school secretary, flight nurse David Park, and pilot Captain Mike Thompson. They had been airborne since 12:20 and were en route to Moose Creek Elementary School. Flight for Life, inbound to Moose Creek Elementary, ETA 3 minutes, Captain Thompson radioed. Request ground crew to prepare landing zone and patient for immediate transport. The helicopter's arrival at 12:31 marked the beginning of the most intensive medical effort to save Margaret Hill's life. The flight crew brought additional advanced life support equipment, including blood products for transfusion and more sophisticated cardiac monitoring devices. Flight paramedic Jennifer Walsh took over primary patient care from the ground-based EMS crew. Her assessment confirmed what Lisa Chen and Brad Johnson had already determined. Margaret Hill had suffered injuries that were likely incompatible with survival. Patient presence with massive head and neck trauma, probable cervical spine fractures and severe hemorrhagic shock, Jennifer radioed to the trauma center. Blood pressure is not obtainable. Heart rate is approximately 20 beats per minute and thready. We're continuing full resuscitation efforts during transport. The helicopter crew worked rapidly to prepare Margaret for transport, but their efforts were complicated by the severity of her injuries and the continued bleeding from multiple wound sites. Margaret was loaded into the helicopter at 12:34, approximately 23 minutes after the initial attack. The flight to St. John's Medical Center in Jackson took 12 minutes, during which the flight crew continued aggressive resuscitation efforts. However, Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate during the flight, and her heart stopped completely twice, requiring additional rounds of CPR. St. John's Trauma Center, this is Flight for Life inbound with bear attack victim, Jennifer radioed ahead. Female, approximately 68 years old, massive traumatic injuries, currently in full cardiac arrest. Request trauma team activation for immediate surgical intervention. The helicopter landed at St. John's Medical Center at 12:46, where a full trauma team was waiting in the emergency department. The team was led by Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a board-certified emergency physician with 15 years of experience, and Dr. Sarah Kim, a trauma surgeon who had recently completed her residency training. Margaret Hill was rushed into Trauma Bay 1, where the medical team immediately began the most advanced life support measures available. However, their initial assessment confirmed what the flight crew had suspected. Margaret's injuries were so severe that survival was extremely unlikely. Patient has suffered massive crushing injuries to the skull and cervical spine, with complete transaction of the carotid artery and jugular vein, Dr. Rodriguez documented in his notes. There are multiple deep lacerations to the scalp and face and probable intracranial hemorrhage. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, the patient remains in profound shock with no obtainable blood pressure. The trauma team worked on Margaret for 47 minutes, using every available medical intervention to try to save her life. They administered multiple units of blood products, performed emergency surgery to repair the damaged blood vessels in her neck, and used advanced cardiac medications to try to restore a sustainable heart rhythm. However, at 1:33 in the afternoon, Dr. Kim made the difficult decision to discontinue resuscitation efforts. Margaret Hill was pronounced dead at 1:33 and 47 seconds, approximately 2 hours and 22 minutes after Bear 379 had first attacked her. Back at Moose Creek Elementary School, the immediate crisis had ended, but the psychological trauma was just beginning. The school remained in lockdown, while crime scene investigators and wildlife officials processed the scene and removed Bear 379's body. Bear number 379 had died from the combination of the tranquilizer drugs and the rifle shot administered by Warden Rodriguez. Wildlife officials determined that the bear would be sent to the Wyoming Game and Fish Laboratory for a complete necropsy to determine if there were any underlying factors that had contributed to his aggressive behavior. Principal Janet Martinez faced the difficult task of informing parents about what had happened and arranging for grief counselors to help students and staff process the traumatic event. The school's 112 students had been kept inside their classrooms during the entire incident, but many had heard the gunshots and emergency vehicle sirens, and several had witnessed portions of the attack through classroom windows. Timothy Hill, who had been waiting in the nurse's station to be picked up by his grandmother, was among the most severely affected. Pat Williams had managed to keep him away from the windows during the attack, but Timothy knew that his grandmother had come to the school and was asking increasingly insistent questions about why he couldn't go see her. "Where's Grandma Maggie?" Timothy asked Pat for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "She's here to take me home, isn't she?" Pat Williams struggled with how to respond to the 8-year-old's questions. She knew that Timothy's parents would need to be the ones to tell him about his grandmother's death, but she also knew that she couldn't continue to deflect his questions indefinitely. "Timothy, honey, your mom and dad are on their way to the school right now," Pat finally said. "They'll be here very soon, and they'll explain everything to you." Sarah Hill, Timothy's mother, had been at the county hospital when she received the emergency call from Principal Martinez at 12:45. The principal had been careful not to provide specific details over the phone, but Sarah understood that there had been a serious incident involving her mother-in-law and that she needed to come to the school immediately. Sarah's husband David was still in Cheyenne at his work training, and it would take him at least 3 hours to drive back to Moose Creek. Sarah contacted David and told him what little she knew about the situation, and David immediately left the training session and began the drive home. When Sarah arrived at the school at 1:15, she was met by Principal Martinez and 2 grief counselors who'd been called in from the county mental health services. Sarah was taken to a private office where she was given the devastating news about her mother-in-law's death. "Sarah, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this," Principal Martinez said gently. "Margaret was attacked by a bear in our parking lot this morning. The emergency responders did everything they could, but her injuries were too severe." Sarah's initial reaction was disbelief. Margaret Hill had been such a fixture in their family's life, such a constant and reliable presence, that the idea of her sudden, violent death seemed impossible to accept. "A bear," Sarah repeated, struggling to process the information. "What do you mean, a bear?" "Bears don't attack people in parking lots." The grief counselor, Dr. Patricia Anderson, had extensive experience helping people cope with sudden traumatic deaths. She recognized that Sarah was in the initial stage of shock and would need time and support to fully comprehend what had happened. "I know this is an enormous shock," Dr. Anderson said. "What happened today was extremely unusual and tragic. Right now, the most important thing is that you're safe and that we help Timothy understand what's happened in an age-appropriate way." The task of telling 8-year-old Timothy that his beloved grandmother was dead was perhaps the most difficult challenge facing the Hill family. Timothy and Margaret had been extremely close, and he had been looking forward to spending the afternoon with her, watching nature documentaries and drinking chamomile tea. Sarah, accompanied by Dr. Anderson, went to the nurses' station where Timothy was still waiting. Timothy's face lit up when he saw his mother, and his first question was about when he could see his grandmother. "Mom, is Grandma Maggie okay?" Timothy asked. "Mrs. Williams said you and Dad were coming to explain things." Sarah sat down next to her son and took his hands in hers. She had rehearsed what she would say during her brief meeting with the grief counselor, but now that the moment had arrived, she found it nearly impossible to speak the words that would shatter her son's innocence. "Timothy, honey, I need to tell you something very sad about Grandma Maggie," Sarah began, her voice already breaking with emotion. "There was an accident today, and Grandma Maggie was hurt very badly." Timothy's expression immediately became serious and concerned. "Is she in the hospital? Can we go visit her?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the next words would change her son's life forever. "No, sweetie. Grandma Maggie was hurt so badly that she died. She's not coming home." Timothy's reaction was initially confusion rather than grief. At 8 years old, he had limited experience with death, and the concept that his grandmother could simply cease to exist was difficult for him to grasp. "What do you mean she died?" Timothy asked. "When will she come back?" The process of helping Timothy understand the permanence of death would take weeks and would require ongoing support from grief counselors and child psychologists. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, Timothy's primary emotions were confusion and a desperate desire to see his grandmother, whom he was certain would return if he waited long enough. The news of Margaret Hill's death spread rapidly through the small community of Moose Creek. Margaret had been a beloved figure who had touched the lives of virtually every family in the area through her decades of teaching. The violent and sudden nature of her death sent shockwaves through a community that was accustomed to the routine dangers of rural life, but had never experienced anything like a fatal bear attack. Local television stations picked up the story by mid-afternoon, and by evening, news of the attack had been reported by regional and national media outlets. The story had all the elements that typically attract media attention: a beloved teacher, an innocent victim, a dramatic wildlife attack, and a small rural community struggling to cope with tragedy. Channel 5. News reporter Amanda Mitchell was the first television journalist to arrive at Moose Creek Elementary School. Mitchell, a veteran reporter with 12 years of experience covering stories throughout Wyoming, had covered various wildlife-related incidents, but never a fatal bear attack. This is Amanda Mitchell reporting from Moose Creek Elementary School, where this morning a beloved retired teacher was killed in a shocking bear attack, Mitchell reported in her live broadcast at 6 o'clock. 68-year-old Margaret Hill was waiting to pick up her grandson when she was attacked and killed by a grizzly bear in the school's parking lot. The television coverage brought unwanted attention to the small community, with additional reporters arriving from as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City. The media attention was particularly difficult for the Hill family, who were trying to grieve privately while simultaneously dealing with requests for interviews and statements. David Hill, who had driven back from Cheyenne in record time, arrived at the family's home at 4:30 in the afternoon to find two news vans parked on the road outside his house. David was exhausted from the 3-hour drive and devastated by the loss of his mother, and the presence of reporters added an additional layer of stress to an already unbearable situation. "Please, we just need some privacy right now," David told the reporters who approached him as he got out of his truck. "We're trying to help our son understand what happened, and we're not ready to make any public statements." Most of the reporters respected the family's request for privacy, but the story continued to generate significant media interest throughout the weekend. The fact that the attack had occurred at a school, in front of witnesses including children, made it particularly newsworthy and emotionally compelling. Wyoming Game and Fish Department officials faced intense scrutiny about why a grizzly bear had been in the area and whether adequate precautions had been taken to protect the school. Department spokesman Jake Morrison held a press conference on Saturday morning to address some of the questions that had been raised by the media and the public. "Our preliminary investigation indicates that this was an adult male grizzly bear that had emerged from hibernation early due to disturbance of his den site," Morrison explained. "The bear had been tracked through GPS collar data, but his recent movements had not indicated that he posed an immediate threat to developed areas." Morrison also addressed questions about whether the school's security measures had been adequate. "The chain-link fence around the school was installed following recommendations from our department and was considered adequate for deterring casual wildlife intrusions. However, a determined predator like a grizzly bear can easily overcome such barriers." The Game and Fish Department announced that they would be reviewing their protocols for monitoring bears that had emerged from hibernation early and would be working with school districts throughout the region to assess the adequacy of existing wildlife deterrent measures. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the University of Wyoming wildlife biologist who had been monitoring bear number 379's GPS collar data, found herself at the center of a controversy about whether more could have been done to prevent the attack. Dr. Rodriguez had been tracking the bear's movements through the collar data, but the bear's recent erratic behavior had not been deemed to pose an immediate threat to human safety. "In retrospect, we can see that the bear's movement patterns in the days before the attack were consistent with an animal under extreme stress," Dr. Rodriguez explained in an interview with the Jackson Hole News and Guide. "However, the bear had never approached developed areas during the period we were monitoring him, and his movements, while unusual, were not outside the range of normal variation for bears in similar circumstances." The controversy over whether the attack could have been prevented would continue for months and would eventually result in changes to wildlife monitoring protocols throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The necropsy performed on bear number 379 revealed several factors that had contributed to his aggressive behavior. The bear was found to be significantly underweight for his age and size, indicating that he had been unable to find adequate food sources since emerging from hibernation. The bear also showed signs of dental problems that would have made it difficult for him to process his normal diet of roots, berries, and other vegetation. Most significantly, the necropsy revealed that the bear had been suffering from a parasitic infection that could have affected his neurological function and contributed to his erratic behavior. While the infection was not severe enough to be immediately life-threatening, it could have impaired the bear's judgment and made him more likely to take risks, such as approaching human development areas. The combination of malnutrition, dental problems, and parasitic infection created a perfect storm of factors that contributed to this bear's aggressive behavior, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinarian who performed the necropsy. Under normal circumstances, a healthy bear would have avoided the school area entirely. The necropsy results provided some explanation for the attack, but they offered little comfort to the Hill family and the other members of the Moose Creek community who were struggling to cope with the trauma of Margaret's death. The funeral service for Margaret Eleanor Hill was held on Wednesday, January 15th, at the Moose Creek Community Church. The small church, which normally held about 150 people, was packed beyond capacity with mourners who had come to pay their respects to the woman who had been a cornerstone of their community for nearly 4 decades. The service was conducted by Reverend Michael Thompson, who had known Margaret for 15 years and had watched her transition from active teacher to beloved grandmother. Reverend Thompson struggled to find words that could adequately capture Margaret's impact on the community, while also providing comfort to those who were grieving her violent death. Margaret Hill was the kind of person who made everyone around her better, Reverend Thompson said in his eulogy. She taught our children not just reading and mathematics, but kindness, curiosity, and compassion. Her legacy lives on in the thousands of young people whose lives she touched during her career. The church service was followed by a burial at the Moose Creek Cemetery, where Margaret was laid to rest next to her husband Robert. The graveside service was attended by a smaller group of family and close friends, including many of Margaret's former students who had traveled from across Wyoming to attend the funeral. 8-year-old Timothy Hill attended both services, though his understanding of what was happening remained limited. Timothy had been seeing a child psychologist, Dr. Maria Santos, twice a week since his grandmother's death, and Dr. Santos had worked with the family to prepare Timothy for the funeral experience. Timothy understands that his grandmother has died, but he's still struggling with the concept of permanence, Dr. Santos explained to David and Sarah Hill. It's normal for children his age to continue expecting the deceased person to return, especially when the death was sudden and traumatic. Timothy's questions about his grandmother's death had evolved over the 5 days since the attack, but they remained centered on the hope that Margaret might somehow return. During the funeral service, Timothy asked his father several times when Grandma Maggie would wake up and whether she would be home in time for dinner. The Hill family's grief was complicated by Timothy's continued difficulty accepting the reality of his grandmother's death. David and Sarah found themselves reliving their own trauma every time Timothy asked about Margaret, and they began seeing a family counselor to help them navigate the complex emotions surrounding their loss. The broader Moose Creek community also struggled with the psychological aftermath of the attack. Many residents found themselves looking over their shoulders when they went outside, particularly in areas near the forest boundary. The attack had shattered the sense of security that residents had previously felt in their rural community. Moose Creek Elementary School remained closed for the remainder of the week following the attack, giving students and staff time to process what had happened and to receive counseling support. When classes resumed the following Monday, the school had implemented several new security measures, including additional fencing and a new protocol for outdoor activities. Principal Janet Martinez, who had witnessed the attack through the school's main entrance window, found herself struggling with her own trauma while simultaneously trying to support her staff and students. Martinez had been working with a trauma counselor and was considering taking a leave of absence to focus on her own recovery. "I keep seeing it happen over and over again," Martinez confided to her sister during a phone call 3 weeks after the attack. "I close my eyes and I see Mrs. Hill standing there. And then I see the bear. And I wonder if there was something more I could have done to save her." The psychological impact of witnessing the attack extended to many of the students who had seen portions of the violence through their classroom windows. Third-grade teacher Amanda Foster reported that several of her students were having nightmares and were reluctant to participate in outdoor activities. "The children keep asking questions that I don't know how to answer," Amanda explained to the school's grief counselors. "They want to know why the bear hurt Mrs. Hill and whether it could happen to them or their families. The school district brought in a team of child psychologists and trauma counselors to work with students who had been affected by the attack. The counselors used age-appropriate techniques, including art therapy and play therapy, to help children process their emotions and fears. 6 weeks after the attack, most of the students had returned to their normal routines, but several continued to require ongoing counseling support. The experience had been particularly traumatic for the children who had been students in Margaret's classes, as they had to cope with both the loss of their former teacher and the terrifying manner of her death. The legal aftermath of Margaret Hill's death involved several investigations and potential liability issues. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department conducted a comprehensive review of their bear monitoring protocols, while the Teton County Sheriff's Department investigated whether any criminal negligence had contributed to the attack. The Hill family consulted with attorney Robert Chang, a personal injury lawyer based in Jackson, about potential legal action against various parties. Chang reviewed the circumstances of the attack and concluded that while the incident was tragic, it was unlikely that any party could be held legally responsible for Margaret's death. This appears to have been a genuinely unforeseeable accident, Chang explained to the family. The school district had followed recommended safety protocols, and the wildlife officials had no reason to believe that this particular bear posed an immediate threat to human safety. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department did implement several policy changes in response to the attack. New protocols were established for monitoring bears that emerged from hibernation early, and additional resources were allocated for bear management in areas near schools and other public facilities. The school district also made changes to their emergency protocols and wildlife deterrent measures. The chain-link fence around Moose Creek Elementary was replaced with a taller, more robust barrier, and staff received additional training on wildlife emergency procedures. 3 months after the attack, the psychological scars remained deep for those who had been most directly affected. David Hill had returned to work, but he found it difficult to concentrate and was considering changing careers to something that would allow him to spend more time with his family. Sarah Hill had reduced her hours at the county hospital and was spending more time at home with Timothy. The family had sold Margaret's house and had donated many of her belongings to charity, but they had kept some of her personal items, including the teaching materials that had defined her career. Timothy continued to see Dr. Santos twice a week and had made significant progress in accepting his grandmother's death. However, he still had occasional episodes where he would ask when Grandma Maggie was coming to visit, and he continued to have nightmares about bears. Timothy has made remarkable progress, Dr. Santos explained to his parents during a consultation session. He's beginning to understand that his grandmother isn't coming back, and he's developing coping strategies for dealing with his grief. However, this type of trauma can have long-lasting effects, and he'll probably need ongoing support throughout his childhood. The Moose Creek community had also begun to heal, though the attack remained a defining event that had changed the character of the town. Residents were more cautious about outdoor activities, and parents were more protective of their children when they played outside. A memorial scholarship had been established in Margaret Hill's name, providing funding for education students at the University of Wyoming who planned to teach in rural communities. The scholarship had raised over $50,000 in its first 3 months, demonstrating the lasting impact that Margaret had made on her community. 1 year after the attack, the Hill family participated in a memorial service at Moose Creek Elementary School. A bronze plaque had been installed near the school's main entrance, commemorating Margaret's 37 years of service as an educator and her dedication to the children of Moose Creek. The memorial service was attended by more than 300 people, including many of Margaret's former students who had traveled from across the country to honor their beloved teacher. The service included testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's teaching and mentorship. Mrs. Hill taught me that every child has potential and that a good teacher's job is to help them discover it, said Jennifer Martinez, who had been one of Margaret's students 25 years earlier and was now a teacher herself. She showed us what it means to care about education and to care about kids. Timothy Hill, now 9 years old, participated in the memorial service by reading a letter he had written to his grandmother. The letter, composed with help from Dr. Santos, demonstrated how much Timothy had grown in his understanding of his grandmother's death and his ability to cope with his loss. "Dear Grandma Maggie," Timothy read from the podium, his voice clear and strong, "I miss you every day, but I know you're watching over me. I'm doing good in school, and I'm learning to be brave like you taught me. I hope you're proud of me." The memorial service marked a milestone in the community's healing process, though the impact of January 10th, 2025 would never be completely forgotten. Margaret Hill's violent death had changed Moose Creek forever, but her legacy as an educator and mentor continued to inspire the people whose lives she had touched. The incident also led to broader changes in wildlife management policies throughout Wyoming and other states, with significant grizzly bear populations. Bear monitoring protocols were enhanced, and additional resources were allocated for managing human-wildlife conflicts in areas near schools and other public facilities. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the wildlife biologist who had been monitoring bear number 379, continued her research, but with a renewed focus on understanding the factors that could lead to aggressive behavior in bears. Her work would eventually contribute to improved early warning systems for identifying potentially dangerous wildlife. Margaret Hill's death was a tragedy that we can't undo, Dr. Rodriguez reflected during an interview on the first anniversary of the attack. But if we can learn from what happened and prevent similar tragedies in the future, then perhaps her death will have some meaning. The story of Margaret Hill's death serves as a sobering reminder of the inherent risks of living in areas where humans and large predators coexist. While such attacks remain extremely rare, they highlight the importance of maintaining respect for wildlife and implementing appropriate safety measures in vulnerable areas. For the Hill family, the healing process continued beyond the first anniversary of Margaret's death. Timothy had made remarkable progress in therapy and was developing into a resilient young man who carried forward his grandmother's values of curiosity, kindness, and determination. Sarah and David Hill had found ways to honor Margaret's memory while building a new life for their family. They had become advocates for wildlife safety education and had worked with the school district to develop educational programs that taught children about coexisting safely with wildlife. The family had also established a tradition of visiting Margaret's grave every Friday afternoon, the day of the week when she had been killed. They would bring fresh flowers and spend time talking about their memories of her, ensuring that her legacy of love and dedication would be passed on to future generations. 2 years after the attack, Timothy Hill entered 4th grade at Moose Creek Elementary School. The school had implemented numerous changes since his grandmother's death, including enhanced security measures and improved wildlife deterrent systems. Timothy was thriving academically and had developed a particular interest in science and nature, perhaps inspired by the nature documentaries he had watched with his grandmother. The classroom where Timothy now studied was decorated with posters and educational materials, some of which had been donated by Margaret Hill's estate. Her influence on education in Moose Creek continued even after her death, as her teaching materials and methods were still being used by the current faculty. Principal Janet Martinez had ultimately decided to remain in her position, though she continued to receive counseling support for the trauma she had experienced. Martinez had become a strong advocate for improved wildlife safety measures and had worked closely with state officials to develop better protocols for schools in areas with wildlife populations. Mrs. Hill would have wanted us to learn from what happened and make sure our children are as safe as possible, Martinez explained during a school board meeting. We can't prevent every tragedy, but we can be better prepared and more aware of the risks we face in our rural environment. The changes implemented at Moose Creek Elementary had been adopted by other schools throughout Wyoming and had influenced wildlife safety policies in other states. Margaret Hill's death had catalyzed improvements in school safety that would protect countless other children in the years to come. The psychological impact of the attack continued to affect various members of the community, though most had found ways to cope with their trauma and move forward with their lives. Amanda Foster, the third-grade teacher who had witnessed the attack, had initially considered leaving the teaching profession, but had ultimately decided to stay and honor Margaret's memory by continuing to educate children. I realized that running away from what happened wouldn't honor Mrs. Hill's legacy, Amanda explained. She devoted her life to education, and the best way I can honor her memory is to continue that work. The emergency responders who had been involved in the incident had also been affected by the trauma of dealing with such a violent and unusual situation. Deputy Marcus Webb, the first law enforcement officer to arrive at the scene, had required several months of counseling to process what he had witnessed. "I've seen a lot of difficult things in 12 years of law enforcement," Deputy Webb reflected. "But watching that bear attack an innocent woman and knowing there was nothing I could do to prevent it was one of the most helpless feelings I've ever experienced." Paramedic Lisa Chen and EMT Brad Johnson had also struggled with the aftermath of the incident, particularly because their medical intervention had ultimately been unsuccessful. Both had continued their careers in emergency medical services, but had participated in additional training programs focused on dealing with traumatic calls and managing post-incident stress. Wyoming Game and Fish Warden Tom Rodriguez, who had been responsible for stopping Bear number 379's charge, had been commended for his quick action, but had also been deeply affected by the incident. Rodriguez had been involved in numerous wildlife management situations throughout his 20-year career, but the Margaret Hill attack was the first time he had been forced to kill an animal to protect human life. "It's never easy to take the life of a wild animal, even when it's necessary to protect people," Rodriguez explained. "That bear was just following his instincts, but the situation had reached a point where there was no other choice." The incident had also sparked broader discussions about wildlife management policies and the challenges of balancing conservation goals with public safety concerns. Wyoming's grizzly bear population had been recovering steadily since the 1970s, when the species was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The recovery of the grizzly bear population was considered a conservation success story, but it also meant that encounters between bears and humans were becoming more frequent. Wildlife officials faced the challenging task of protecting both bears and people in areas where their habitats overlapped. "We want grizzly bears to thrive and recover, but we also have a responsibility to protect human life and safety," explained Dr. Mark Johnson, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's chief wildlife biologist. Finding the right balance between those goals requires constant vigilance and adaptive management strategies. The Margaret Hill attack had highlighted the need for improved communication between wildlife officials, school administrators, and local communities. New protocols were established for sharing information about wildlife activity in areas near schools, and alert systems were developed to provide real-time updates about potentially dangerous animals. 3 years after the attack, Bear number 379's GPS collar data was still being analyzed by researchers trying to understand the factors that had contributed to his aggressive behavior. The collar had provided detailed information about the bear's movements in the weeks and months leading up to the attack, offering insights into his behavior patterns and habitat use. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of the collar data had revealed that Bear 379 had been ranging much more widely than normal in the weeks before the attack, suggesting that he had been having difficulty finding adequate food sources. The bear had also been spending more time in lower elevation areas where human activity was more common. The collar data shows us that this bear was under significant stress and was engaging in increasingly risky behavior as he searched for food, Dr. Rodriguez explained. This information is helping us develop better predictive models for identifying bears that might pose a threat to human safety. The research conducted on Bear 379's behavior had contributed to improvements in bear management strategies throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Wildlife officials were now better able to identify bears that were exhibiting concerning behavior patterns and could take proactive measures to reduce the risk of human-wildlife conflicts. The Margaret Hill Memorial Scholarship had continued to grow and had provided funding for 15 education students over its first 3 years. Recipients of the scholarship were required to commit to teaching in rural communities for at least 5 years after graduation, ensuring that Margaret's dedication to rural education would continue through future generations of teachers. One of the scholarship recipients was Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the flight paramedic or school secretary, who had grown up in a small Wyoming town and had been inspired by her own elementary school teachers to pursue a career in education. Jennifer had specifically requested to student teach at Moose Creek Elementary School, wanting to honor Margaret Hill's memory by continuing her work in the same community where she had made such a lasting impact. Mrs. Hill's story has inspired me to dedicate my career to rural education, Jennifer explained during her student teaching semester. I want to carry forward her legacy of caring about every child and making sure that kids in small communities get the same quality education as students in larger cities. Jennifer's presence at Moose Creek Elementary had been particularly meaningful for Timothy Hill, who was now in 5th grade and preparing for his transition to middle school. Timothy had formed a positive relationship with Jennifer and often talked to her about his memories of his grandmother. She always made learning fun, Timothy told Jennifer during a conversation about his grandmother's teaching methods. She would find ways to make math and reading feel like games, and she always had time to help kids who were struggling. Timothy's academic performance had remained strong throughout his elementary school years, and he had developed a particular interest in environmental science and wildlife biology. His teachers believed that his early exposure to wildlife issues, while traumatic, had sparked a genuine curiosity about nature and conservation. The anniversary of Margaret Hill's death continued to be observed each year by the Moose Creek community, with a memorial service and scholarship fundraiser held at the school. The event served as both a commemoration of Margaret's life and a reminder of the importance of wildlife safety in rural communities. 4 years after the attack, the physical evidence of the tragedy had largely been removed from the school grounds. The damaged snow and grass had been replaced, and new landscaping had been installed in the parking area. However, the memorial plaque near the school's entrance served as a permanent reminder of Margaret's contributions to the community and the circumstances of her death. The school's enhanced security measures had become a routine part of daily operations, with staff and students accepting the additional precautions as a normal part of life in a rural area with significant wildlife populations. The new fencing and alarm systems had not deterred any additional wildlife encounters, but they had provided peace of mind for parents and school officials. Timothy Hill had grown into a thoughtful and resilient young man who carried forward many of his grandmother's qualities. He was known among his classmates for his kindness and his willingness to help others, traits that his family attributed to Margaret's influence during his early childhood. Timothy has his grandmother's heart, his mother Sarah observed. He cares about people and wants to make a difference in the world, just like she did. Timothy had also developed a mature understanding of wildlife and conservation issues, recognizing both the beauty and the potential dangers of living in areas with large predators. He had participated in several educational programs about wildlife safety and had even given presentations to younger students about the importance of respecting wild animals. The Hill family had found ways to integrate their memories of Margaret into their ongoing lives, celebrating her birthday each year and maintaining traditions that she had established. They continued to visit her grave regularly, and they had created a small memorial garden at their home with flowers that Margaret had loved. David Hill had ultimately decided to change careers, leaving his job with the Wyoming Department of Transportation to become a teacher himself. Inspired by his mother's dedication to education, David had completed a master's degree in education and was now teaching high school mathematics in a neighboring school district. My mother always said that teaching was the most important job in the world because teachers shape the future, David explained to his new colleagues. I realized that I wanted to carry forward her commitment to helping young people learn and grow. Sarah Hill had also made significant life changes, reducing her hospital hours to focus more on her family while also becoming involved in wildlife safety advocacy. She had worked with state officials to develop educational materials for families living in areas with wildlife populations, helping other parents understand how to keep their children safe while still allowing them to enjoy outdoor activities. The broader impact of Margaret Hill's death continued to influence wildlife management policies and school safety protocols throughout the American West. The incident had become a case study used in training programs for wildlife officials, emergency responders, and school administrators. 5 years after the attack, a comprehensive report was published by the University of Wyoming analyzing the incident and its aftermath. The report, authored by Dr. Elena Rodriguez and several colleagues, provided detailed recommendations for preventing similar tragedies while maintaining appropriate wildlife conservation goals. The Margaret Hill incident represents a tragic convergence of factors that created an extremely dangerous situation, the report concluded. While we cannot prevent every human-wildlife conflict, we can implement better monitoring systems, improved communication protocols, and enhanced safety measures to reduce the risk of future tragedies. The report's recommendations were adopted by wildlife management agencies throughout the region and influenced national policies for managing human-wildlife conflicts in areas near schools and other public facilities. Margaret Hill's legacy extended far beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. Her 37 years of dedicated teaching had influenced thousands of students, many of whom had gone on to successful careers and had attributed their achievements to the foundation she had provided during their elementary school years. The Margaret Hill Memorial Scholarship had grown to become one of the largest education scholarships in Wyoming, and had funded the training of 25 teachers who were now working in rural schools throughout the state. Each of these teachers carried forward Margaret's commitment to rural education and her belief that every child deserved access to quality learning opportunities. The memorial plaque at Moose Creek Elementary School had become a site of reflection and remembrance, visited not only by Margaret's former students and colleagues, but also by educators from throughout the region who had been inspired by her story. The plaque's inscription captured the essence of Margaret's life and work. In memory of Margaret Eleanor Hill, 1956 to 2025. Dedicated teacher, beloved grandmother, and friend to all children. Her legacy of love, learning and service continues to inspire future generations. As the 5th anniversary of the attack approached, the Moose Creek community prepared for another memorial service, recognizing both the tragedy of Margaret's death and the positive changes that had emerged from their collective grief. The community had demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of trauma, finding ways to honor Margaret's memory while building a safer and stronger future for their children. Timothy Hill, now 13 years old and entering 8th grade, had grown into a young man who embodied many of his grandmother's finest qualities. He was compassionate, intelligent, and committed to helping others, and he had developed a particular interest in environmental conservation and wildlife management. "I want to find ways to help people and animals coexist safely," Timothy explained when asked about his future career plans. "Maybe I can prevent other families from going through what we experienced." Timothy's aspirations reflected the positive legacy that had emerged from the tragedy of his grandmother's death. Margaret Hill's violent end had catalyzed changes that would protect countless other families, and her life's work continued to influence new generations of educators and students. The story of January 10th, 2025, would never be forgotten by those who lived through it, but it had evolved from a tale of senseless tragedy to one of community resilience, positive change, and enduring love. Margaret Hill's legacy lived on not only in the memories of those who knew her, but in the concrete improvements to wildlife safety and education that had emerged from their collective grief. As the sun set over Moose Creek Elementary School on another Friday afternoon, the building stood as a testament to both the fragility of life and the enduring power of education to shape the future. Margaret Hill's classroom had been occupied by other teachers, but her influence permeated the entire school, reminding everyone who entered of the profound impact that one dedicated educator could have on an entire community. The bear that had taken her life was gone, but the wilderness that surrounded Moose Creek remained, beautiful and wild, and forever changed by the events of that winter morning when a beloved teacher's routine act of love for her grandson had ended in tragedy. Yet, from that tragedy had emerged a stronger community, better safety measures, and a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between humans and the natural world they shared. Margaret Eleanor Hill had taught her final lesson not in a classroom, but in the parking lot of the school where she had devoted her career to nurturing young minds. That lesson, written in loss and sorrow but ultimately transcending both, would continue to educate and inspire long after the last witness to her death had passed from memory. In death, as in life, she remained a teacher, and her most important lesson was about the enduring power of love, community, and hope in the face of even the most senseless tragedy.